You want to see what happens when absolute power meets the one thing it cannot break? Stay with me, because what you are about to witness is not a fairy tale. It is a collision. The kind that leaves scars on stone and changes the entire architecture of control. This is the story of Duke Alaric Varrington, a man who turned silence into currency and fear into law, and the woman who walked into his fortress and refused to kneel. By the end, you will understand why some battles are not fought with swords, but with words that cut deeper than any blade. Watch until the final moment. Drop a like if you are ready to see power stripped down to its skeleton, and tell me in the comments what city you are watching from. Let us begin. The storm had been hammering the cliffs for 3 days straight when the messenger arrived at Blackstone Citadel. Rain came sideways, cutting visibility to nothing, but the guard at the outer gate recognized the ducal seal on the rider's cloak and opened the iron doors without hesitation. Inside, the corridors were dry but no warmer. Stone absorbed cold the way flesh absorbed bruises, and this place had been built to endure, not to comfort. Duke Alaric Varrington stood in the eastern tower watching the sea churn itself into white violence below. He did not move when the door opened behind him. Footsteps approached, measured and deliberate. His chamberlain, Lord Castor Theron, stopped 3 paces back and waited. Alaric let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, then spoke without turning. "How many dead?" Theron cleared his throat. 17 confirmed, another dozen missing. The eastern road is gone, washed into the ravine. Supplies to the border garrison are delayed indefinitely. Alaric turned slowly. His face was carved from the same stone as the citadel itself, sharp angles and no warmth. His eyes were dark gray, the color of iron left too long in rain. He was not a large man, but his presence filled rooms in a way that made size irrelevant. When he looked at you, you felt measured, assessed, and often found insufficient. "Delayed is the language of incompetence," Alaric said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of tone that made people lean in to hear and regret doing so. The garrison receives supplies on schedule, or the logistics officer explains his failure in person. Which outcome do you prefer to arrange? Theron swallowed. "I will dispatch a secondary route immediately, Your Grace. The southern pass remains passable." "Then why are we discussing this?" Theron bowed and left without another word. Alaric turned back to the window. Control was not maintained through shouting or threats. It was maintained through expectation. People feared disappointing him more than they feared punishment, and that calculus kept the duchy running with mechanical precision. Failure was not tolerated because failure implied the system itself could fracture. And Alaric Varrington had spent 15 years ensuring that fracture was impossible. He descended the tower stairs and moved through the citadel with the steady rhythm of a man who never hurried because nothing ever required haste. Servants pressed themselves against walls as he passed, eyes down, breath held. Minor nobles in the grand hall fell silent mid-conversation when his shadow crossed the threshold. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. Everyone waited. "The northern timber contracts," Alaric said. "Speak." A balding man in green velvet stepped forward, sweating despite the cold. "Your Grace, the contractors are requesting a renegotiation of terms. They claim the increased tariffs from the crown have made the current rates untenable." Alaric studied him for 3 long seconds. "And you believe their claims merit my attention?" The man opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I thought it prudent to inform you of potential disruption to the supply chain. Inform the contractors that the duchy does not renegotiate. We enforce. If they choose to breach contract, they forfeit their operating licenses and their assets revert to ducal control. If they choose to comply, they continue profiting under terms they agreed to in writing. Present those options and return with their decision by noon tomorrow." The man bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knee. "Yes, Your Grace." Immediately. Alaric dismissed him with a glance and continued across the hall. Another minister approached, this one younger, sharper-eyed. "Your Grace, the council meeting has been moved to the 2nd hour. Lady Maris requests your presence for preliminary discussion of the grain subsidies." Alaric stopped. "Lady Maris requests." The minister paled. She mentioned it would be beneficial to align on key points before the broader session." Alaric leaned in slightly. His voice dropped to something just above a whisper. "I do not align. I decide. If Lady Maris has concerns, she may voice them during the council meeting where all voices are heard equally and dismissed with equal efficiency." You will inform her that preliminary discussions are not requested, not offered, and not tolerated. Am I clear? Perfectly, Your Grace. Good. Now leave my sight before I reconsider your usefulness." The minister fled. Alaric straightened and looked across the hall. Dozens of eyes snapped away, suddenly fascinated by tapestries and floor tiles. This was the architecture of power, not the stone walls or the iron gates, but the invisible structure of fear and respect that made people govern themselves before you ever had to govern them. Alaric had built that structure one decision at a time, one example at a time, until obedience became reflex. He walked to his private study and closed the door. The room was austere, a desk of black oak, shelves lined with legal texts and territorial maps, a single chair, uncomfortable by design. Comfort bred complacency. Complacency bred weakness. Alaric sat and opened the latest intelligence report from his network of informants embedded throughout the duchy and beyond. Grain prices rising in the southern provinces. Minor house alliances shifting after the Carmine wedding. Whispers of unrest in the mining districts. None of it concerned him. Unrest was expected. People always wanted more than they had. The trick was to let them voice complaints in controlled forms, where dissent could be monitored and managed before it metastasized into action. Alaric had perfected that system. Public grievance sessions held quarterly, recorded in detail, investigated thoroughly, and resolved with enough visible fairness to maintain the illusion of responsiveness. The reality was simpler. Complaints were noted, troublemakers were identified. Problems were solved quietly, often permanently. A knock at the door. Enter. Theron stepped inside, holding a sealed letter. "Your Grace, this arrived by private courier. The sender requested immediate delivery to you personally." Alaric took the letter. The seal was unfamiliar. Not one of the major houses. Not a guild mark. He broke the wax and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was precise, confident, economical. "Duke Varrington. I am Lady Seraphine Lorne. You do not know my name because my family was erased from record before I was old enough to understand why. I am writing to request an audience. I do not come seeking charity or restoration of titles. I come offering capability. You have a court full of advisors who tell you what you want to hear. I will tell you what you need to hear. If that interests you, I will be at the Crescent Inn in Lower Varrington for the next 3 days. If it does not, burn this letter and forget I exist." Alaric read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and looked at Theron. "What do you know about House Lorne?" Theron frowned. "Lorne? The name is vaguely familiar. I believe they were minor nobility, stripped of rank during the Consolidation Wars. Lord Matthias Lorne was implicated in a conspiracy against your father. The family was exiled and their holdings absorbed into the ducal estate." Alaric leaned back. "And now his daughter wants an audience." "It appears so. Your opinion?" Theron hesitated. "It could be a trap. It could be genuine. Without more information, it is impossible to assess intent." Alaric smiled, a thin and humorless expression. "That is why it interests me. Send word to the Crescent Inn. Lady Seraphine Lorne will attend me here tomorrow at midday. Alone. Unarmed. If she objects to those terms, she can return to whatever hole produced her. As you wish, Your Grace." Theron left. Alaric picked up the letter again and held it to the candlelight. The paper was of decent quality but not extravagant. The handwriting showed discipline. No flourishes. No wasted ink. Whoever this woman was, she understood economy of communication. That alone set her apart from the performative verbosity of most nobles who mistook length for substance. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Tomorrow would reveal whether Lady Seraphine Lorne was a useful tool or a soon-to-be-forgotten footnote. Checks. Lady Seraphine Lorne arrived at Blackstone Citadel exactly at midday. She wore a dark blue traveling cloak over a simple gray dress. No jewelry, no house colors. Her hair was pulled back in a single braid, and her face was composed in a way that suggested she had practiced neutrality until it became instinct. She was not beautiful in the decorative sense. Her features were too sharp, her expression too guarded. But there was something in the way she moved, a kind of deliberate precision that made people notice. The guards searched her thoroughly at the outer gate, then again at the inner courtyard, then a third time outside the study. She endured it without complaint. When they finally opened the door, she stepped inside and stopped 3 paces from the desk. Alaric did not look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was writing, set down his pen, and only then raised his eyes. Lady Lorne. Duke Verrington. Her voice was clear and even. No tremor, no deference. She met his gaze without flinching, which was rare. Most people looked away within seconds. Alaric gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. She sat, back straight, hands folded in her lap. Alaric studied her for a long moment. She did not fill the silence with nervous chatter, another point in her favor. You claim your family was erased from record, Alaric said. That is not entirely accurate. Your father conspired to assassinate mine during the treaty negotiations at Greymore. He failed. He was executed. His co-conspirators were executed. His house was dissolved. Those are the facts. What part of that narrative do you dispute? Seraphine did not blink. None of it. Alaric raised an eyebrow. Then why are you here? Because erasure and justice are not the same thing. My father committed treason. He deserved execution. But his crime was used as justification to seize lands that had belonged to House Lorne for 8 generations. My mother and siblings were exiled without trial, without evidence of complicity, and without means to survive. 2 of my brothers died in the first winter. My mother followed a year later. I survived because I learned quickly that survival requires capability, not justice. Alaric leaned back. And you believe I owe you restitution? No. I believe you have use for someone who understands that the duchy is not held together by tradition or loyalty, but by constant pressure. Your court is filled with people who agree with you because disagreement is dangerous. That makes them useless. I offer something different. I will tell you when you are wrong, and I will tell you why, and if you execute me for it, at least you will have heard the truth before I die. Alaric smiled slightly. Bold words. Suicidal, but bold. What makes you think your truth has value? Seraphine leaned forward an inch. Because you are not afraid of dissent. You are afraid of incompetence. Every person in this citadel is terrified of failing you, so they hide problems until they become crises. I will not hide problems. I will identify them, isolate them, and propose solutions. If you reject those solutions, that is your prerogative. But you will make informed decisions, not reactive ones. Alaric considered this. And what do you want in return? Access. Not to wealth or titles. To the room where decisions are made. I want to learn how power functions at this level. In exchange, you get an advisor who has no stake in existing power structures and no reason to protect incompetence. He stood and walked to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the sky bruised and heavy. Below, the citadel grounds were a hive of activity. Servants, soldiers, merchants, all moving within the framework of order he had imposed. He spoke without turning. You understand that if you fail me, the consequences will be severe. I understand. And if you betray me, the consequences will be creative. I would expect nothing less. Alaric turned. Good. You will begin immediately. There is a council meeting this afternoon. You will attend as an observer. You will say nothing unless I invite your opinion. You will take notes. Afterward, you will provide a written assessment of every minister's competence, every proposal's viability, and every alliance's stability. Deliver it to me by morning. If your assessment proves insightful, we continue. If it proves useless, you leave Blackstone Citadel and do not return. Seraphine stood. Understood. One more thing. Do not mistake my willingness to listen for weakness. I am not your ally. I am your employer. You serve at my pleasure, and my pleasure is contingent on your value. The moment you stop being useful, you stop existing in my consideration. Are we clear? Perfectly. Good. Theron will show you to the council chamber. She bowed slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than submission, and left. Alaric watched the door close, then returned to his desk. He had no illusions about Lady Seraphine Lorne. She was ambitious, calculating, and likely dangerous. But danger was only a problem if it could not be controlled. And Alaric Verrington had built an entire duchy on the principle that everything could be controlled if you applied enough pressure in the right places. He picked up his pen and returned to his correspondence. Outside, the citadel continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent to the arrival of one more player in a game that had been running for generations. The council chamber was a long rectangular room with high ceilings and narrow windows that let in just enough light to see faces but not enough to soften them. A table of dark wood dominated the center, surrounded by chairs occupied by the duchy's key ministers. At the head sat Duke Alaric Verrington. Along the side sat Lord Castor Theron, Lady Maris Caldane, Sir Rowan Halth, Minister Orrin Vex, and half a dozen others whose names Seraphine had memorized from the duchy records she had studied obsessively for months. She sat in a chair against the wall, far enough back to be unobtrusive, but close enough to hear every word. Alaric had not introduced her. He had simply gestured to the chair, and she had taken it. No one questioned her presence. No one looked at her directly. That was how power worked here. If the Duke permitted it, it was permitted. If he did not, it was not. The meeting began with reports. Grain yields in the southern provinces, trade disputes with the riverlands, infrastructure repairs needed along the eastern highway. Each minister spoke in turn, delivering information in clipped, efficient tones. Alaric listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When the reports concluded, he leaned forward slightly. The grain yields are down 12% from last year. Explain. Lady Maris Caldane, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, responded immediately. Late frost in the planting season, Your Grace. Combined with irregular rainfall, the crop output was below projection. We have adjusted subsidy allocations to compensate, but prices will rise in the fourth quarter. Alaric stared at her. Adjusted subsidy allocations? That is bureaucratic language for throwing money at a problem and hoping it disappears. I asked for an explanation, not a budget line. What are you doing to prevent this from recurring? Maris hesitated. We are consulting with agricultural specialists to develop more resilient crop rotations. When did those consultations begin? 3 weeks ago. And when will they produce actionable recommendations? Another pause. The timeline is still being determined. Alaric's voice dropped to something colder. In other words, you have no plan. You are reacting to a crisis that could have been anticipated and mitigated months ago. This council exists to prevent problems, not to explain them after they occur. I expect a detailed agricultural stabilization proposal on my desk by the end of the week. If it is inadequate, you will personally tour the affected provinces and explain to the farmers why their yields dropped while your salary remained intact. Dismissed. Maris bowed her head. Yes, Your Grace. Alaric moved on. The trade disputes with the riverlands? Summarize. Minister Orrin Vex, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, stood. The Riverland merchant guilds are protesting the new tariff structure. They claim it disadvantages their goods compared to coastal imports. 3 guilds have filed formal complaints. 2 have threatened to suspend trade pending renegotiation. Alaric did not blink. And your response? I proposed a mediation session to address their concerns and find compromise. Compromise. Alaric repeated the word as if tasting something foul. We do not compromise with merchants who threaten economic disruption. We remind them that access to our markets is a privilege, not a right. Suspend the operating licenses of the 2 guilds that issued threats. Inform them that reinstatement is contingent on full compliance with existing tariff law and a public apology for attempting to leverage trade as a weapon. The 3rd guild that filed complaints without threats will receive a formal hearing. Make the distinction clear. Cooperation is rewarded. Coercion is crushed. Vex swallowed. Yes, Your Grace. Seraphine watched the exchange with clinical detachment. Alaric's method was not negotiation. It was dictation. He did not seek input. He delivered verdicts. The ministers were not advisors. They were executors of his will. The system was efficient, brutal, and entirely dependent on one man's capacity to make correct decisions under pressure. It was also fragile. If Alaric made a significant error, there was no mechanism for correction. The entire structure would crack. The meeting continued. Infrastructure, military readiness, tax collection efficiency. Every topic was addressed with the same cold precision. Ministers spoke. Alaric listened. Alaric decided. The room moved like clockwork, each part performing its function without deviation. Then Sir Rowan Halth, the military commander, raised a new issue. Your Grace, we have received reports of increased bandit activity along the northern border. Caravans are being attacked. Supplies are being stolen. The garrison commander requests additional troops to secure the trade routes. Alaric frowned. Increased activity. Define increased. Rowan consulted his notes. 7 attacks in the past month, up from an average of 2 per month over the previous quarter. Casualties. 4 dead, 11 wounded. Estimated losses in goods total approximately 15,000 gold marks. And the garrison commander believes more troops will solve this. He believes it will improve response time and deterrence. Alaric leaned back. Or it will demonstrate weakness. Banditry thrives on the perception that authority is reactive rather than absolute. Sending additional troops suggests we are responding to pressure rather than eliminating it. I want the bandit camps identified and destroyed. No prisoners, no negotiations. Total eradication. Make it so brutal that the idea of attacking a ducal caravan becomes unthinkable. Use whatever resources are necessary. Report results, not body counts. Rowan nodded. Understood, Your Grace. Seraphine made a note. Effective intimidation. High risk of collateral damage. No consideration for root causes of banditry. Short-term solution masking long-term instability. The meeting concluded. Ministers filed out in silence. Seraphine remained seated until the room was empty, except for Alaric. He did not look at her immediately. He gathered his papers, stacked them with mechanical precision, then finally spoke. Your assessment will be on my desk by dawn. It will. Good. You are dismissed. Seraphine stood, bowed slightly, and left. Outside, the corridors were dimly lit by torches that cast long shadows on stone walls. She walked slowly, replaying every word, every gesture, every shift in tone. This was not a court, it was a machine. And Duke Alaric Varrington was the engineer who kept it running through sheer force of will. She returned to the small chamber she had been assigned, a windowless room with a bed, a desk, and a single candle. She lit the candle, sat down, and began to write. By dawn, the report was finished. Seraphine had not slept. She had written 12 pages of dense analysis, breaking down each minister's performance, each proposal's strengths and weaknesses, and the underlying structural vulnerabilities of the duchy's governance model. She did not soften her conclusions. Lady Maris was competent but reactive. Minister Vex was intelligent but risk-averse. Sir Rowan was loyal but lacked strategic imagination. And Duke Alaric Varrington ruled through control so absolute that it eliminated the possibility of adaptive response. She sealed the report and delivered it to Theron, who took it without comment and disappeared into the Duke's study. Seraphine returned to her chamber and waited. An hour later, Theron reappeared. The Duke requests your presence. She followed him back to the study. Alaric was seated at his desk, her report open in front of him. He did not look up when she entered. Sit. She sat. Alaric turned a page, his expression unreadable. You claim my governance model eliminates adaptive response. I do. Explain. He looked up. She met his gaze. Your system is built on absolute control. Every decision flows through you. That creates efficiency and eliminates dissent, but it also creates a single point of failure. If you make an error, there is no mechanism for correction because no one is empowered to challenge your judgment. Additionally, your ministers are selected for obedience rather than initiative. That makes them excellent at executing orders, but incapable of independent problem solving. If a crisis occurs that you did not anticipate, your response will be delayed because your ministers cannot act without explicit instruction. That delay could be catastrophic. Alaric closed the report. And your solution. Empower a secondary tier of decision-makers, not to override you, but to identify problems early and propose solutions before they reach your desk. Create redundancy in your command structure. Allow dissent in controlled environments where it can be tested and evaluated. You do not need to relinquish control. You need to distribute awareness. He studied her for a long moment. You realize you are describing a system where I am not indispensable. I am describing a system where you are not exhausted. You cannot personally oversee every trade dispute, every bandit raid, every crop failure. You are one man. Even you have limits. The question is whether you acknowledge those limits and build around them, or ignore them until something breaks. Alaric leaned back. Bold. Dangerously bold. Most people would soften that observation to avoid offense. Most people want to survive. I want to be useful. Offense is irrelevant if the analysis is accurate. He smiled, that same thin, humorless expression. You are either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. Then I should fit perfectly into your court. Alaric laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, unexpected and genuine. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the citadel was waking. Servants moved through courtyards. Guards changed shifts. The machine continued. You will remain, he said, not as an observer, as an advisor. You will attend all council meetings. You will provide assessments. You will identify inefficiencies, and you will report directly to me. If your insights prove valuable, you will be compensated. If they prove useless, you will be removed. Simple terms. Agreed. One condition. You will not discuss your assessments with anyone except me. No alliances, no private conversations with ministers, no independent agendas. You are my tool, not a player in your own right. Break that rule, and you will discover that my tolerance for betrayal is absolute zero. Understood. Good. Dismissed. Seraphine stood and turned toward the door. Lady Lorne. She stopped. Alaric did not turn from the window. Welcome to Blackstone Citadel. Try not to die. She left. But Over the following weeks, Seraphine became a fixture in the Duke's inner circle. She attended every council meeting, took meticulous notes, and delivered assessments that were as brutal as they were accurate. She identified corruption in the tax collection office. She exposed inefficiencies in supply chain logistics. She predicted a labor dispute in the mining district 3 days before it erupted and proposed a resolution that prevented escalation. The ministers began to fear her, not because she wielded direct power, but because her observations reached the Duke's ear and resulted in immediate consequences. Incompetence that might have been overlooked was now scrutinized. Laziness that might have been tolerated was now punished. The court adapted. Performance improved. Mistakes decreased. Alaric watched this transformation with interest. He did not trust Seraphine. Trust was a weakness, but he valued her. Value was measurable. She made his governance more effective, and effectiveness was the only currency that mattered. Their interactions became sharper. She challenged his decisions in private. He defended them, sometimes conceding when her logic was sound, more often doubling down when he believed his instinct outweighed her analysis. Their debates were not hostile, but they were intense. Two minds colliding over the architecture of power. One evening, after a particularly contentious council session, Alaric summoned her to his study. She arrived to find him standing by the fire, staring into the flames. Sit. She sat. He did not turn. Do you believe I am cruel? The question surprised her. She considered it carefully. No. He glanced back. Elaborate. Cruelty implies deriving satisfaction from suffering. You do not. You inflict consequences because you believe they are necessary to maintain order. That is not cruelty. It is calculation. Whether that calculation is correct is a separate question. And do you believe it is correct? Sometimes. Not always. When is it incorrect? Alaric turned fully. She did not look away. When the cost of control exceeds the value of what is being controlled. You rule through fear. Fear is effective, but it is also exhausting. People obey because they are afraid, not because they believe in the system. That creates brittleness. If your authority is ever perceived as vulnerable, the entire structure collapses because no one has loyalty. Only compliance. Compliance evaporates the moment enforcement weakens. And what would you propose instead? Not instead. In addition, fear maintains order, but belief sustains it. If your people believed that the duchy served their interests, even partially, they would defend it voluntarily. Right now they obey because they must. If you gave them a reason to obey because they chose to, your power would be unassailable. Alaric walked slowly to his desk and sat. You are suggesting I cultivate loyalty. I am suggesting you cultivate investment. People protect what they have stake in. Right now, they have no stake. They are subjects, not participants. Change that dynamic even marginally, and you reduce the pressure required to maintain control. He tapped his fingers on the desk. Interesting theory. Untested. Then test it. He smiled. Perhaps I will. A long silence stretched between them. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled through the citadel's stone corridors. You are different from what I expected, Alaric said. What did you expect? Someone more desperate, more eager to please, more willing to compromise principles for proximity to power. And instead I find someone who treats power as a subject to study rather than a prize to claim. It is unusual, possibly dangerous, possibly useful. He inclined his head. That remains to be seen. She stood. If there is nothing else, Your Grace, I have reports to complete. Dismissed. She left. Alaric watched the door close, then turned back to the fire. Lady Seraphine Lorne was a variable he had not anticipated. Variables were problems, but sometimes problems were opportunities. The challenge was determining which category she fell into before the decision was made for him. That. 3 months into Seraphine's tenure, the first crack appeared. A border province reported unrest. Not banditry, not isolated violence, organized resistance, villages refusing to pay taxes, militias forming in the forests, symbols of defiance appearing on walls and bridges. Alaric convened an emergency council session. Ministers presented information in rapid succession. The unrest had begun in the town of Kael's Crossing and spread to 6 surrounding settlements. Estimated participants numbered in the hundreds, possibly thousands. Demands included reduced taxation, local governance autonomy, and formal investigation into allegations of corrupt tax collectors. Sir Rowan recommended immediate military intervention, crush the resistance, execute the ringleaders, restore order through force. Lady Maris suggested negotiation, send envoys, address grievances, de-escalate before the situation worsened. Minister Vex proposed economic pressure, blockade the region, cut off supplies, force compliance through deprivation. Alaric listened without expression. Then he turned to Seraphine. Your assessment, every eye in the room fixed on her. She did not hesitate. This is not spontaneous. Organized resistance of this scale requires planning, resources, and leadership. Someone is funding this. Someone with access to the region, understanding of local grievances, and motivation to destabilize your authority. If you crush it militarily, you create martyrs. If you negotiate, you legitimize rebellion. If you blockade, you create humanitarian crisis that spreads unrest further. None of those options address the root cause. Then what do you propose? Alaric said. Find the source. Identify who is organizing and funding the resistance. Cut off the head. Once leadership is gone, the movement fragments. Then offer targeted concessions to the population, not capitulation. Acknowledgement. Investigate the corrupt tax collectors publicly. Punish them visibly. Show that the duchy enforces its own laws. That turns the population from rebels into witnesses to justice. They stop resisting because you have given them what they actually want, which is not autonomy, but fairness. Rowan scoffed. Fairness? We are not running a charity. Seraphine turned to him. No, you are running a duchy. And duchies collapse when the governed believe the system exists only to exploit them. This is not about morality. It is about stability. Give them fairness, and you buy peace. Deny it, and you guarantee the next rebellion will be larger. Alaric raised a hand. Enough. Lady Lorne's proposal has merit. Rowan, deploy intelligence operatives to Kael's Crossing. I want names, locations, funding sources. Maris, draft a formal investigation into tax collection practices in the affected region. Vex, prepare economic relief measures to be deployed once the leadership is neutralized. We address this surgically, not with a hammer. Meeting adjourned. The ministers filed out. Seraphine remained. You disagreed with my approach, Alaric said. No. I disagreed with the methods proposed by your ministers. Your instinct to avoid broad military action was correct. He studied her. You realize some will see this as weakness. Some will. They will be wrong. Strength is not measured by how much force you apply, but by how little force is necessary to achieve your objective. He smiled faintly. You sound like me. Then you are learning. Or you are. They held each other's gaze. The fire crackled. Outside, the citadel continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to the collision of wills occurring within its walls. Dismissed, Alaric said. Seraphine left. Alaric sat alone in the flickering light, thinking. For the first time in 15 years, he wondered if absolute control was the same thing as absolute power. And if it was not, what did that mean for everything he had built? The investigation moved swiftly. Within 10 days, Alaric's intelligence network identified the architect of the resistance. Lord Victor Ashrin, a minor noble with holdings near Kael's Crossing, had been secretly funneling money and weapons to local militias. His motivation was not ideological, it was opportunistic. He believed that destabilizing the border provinces would force Alaric to concede greater regional autonomy, which Ashrin would then exploit to expand his own power base. Alaric did not hesitate. He dispatched Sir Rowan with a contingent of soldiers. Ashrin was arrested at dawn, brought to Blackstone Citadel in chains, and placed in the holding cells beneath the fortress. No trial, no public spectacle. Alaric did not need theater. He needed results. In the dungeon, Ashrin sat on a stone bench, wrists shackled, face bruised from the rough handling during arrest. When the door opened and Duke Alaric Varrington entered alone, Ashrin's expression shifted from fear to confusion. Alaric pulled a chair from the corner and sat facing him. They were 5 feet apart. No guards, no witnesses. Lord Ashrin, Your Grace. Ashrin's voice cracked. This is a misunderstanding. I can explain. No, you cannot. You funded a rebellion. You armed militias. You incited violence against ducal authority. Those are facts. What remains to be determined is whether you die quickly or slowly. Ashrin went pale. Your Grace, please. I was trying to protect the region. The tax collectors were abusive. The people were suffering. I was acting in their interest. You were acting in your own interest. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. You saw instability as opportunity. You believed you could leverage unrest into autonomy and position yourself as a regional power independent of central authority. That calculation was incorrect. You are not clever. You are predictable. And now you are finished. Ashrin dropped his head into his hands. What do you want from me? Names. Everyone who assisted you, everyone who knew, everyone who benefited. Give me the network, and your death will be quick. Refuse, and I will ensure your family joins you in these cells while you watch them suffer for your ambition. Ashrin looked up, eyes wide with terror. My family had nothing to do with this. Then give me names, and they will remain free. A long silence. Then Ashrin spoke, voice hollow. There were 3 others, minor nobles. I will give you their names, their locations, everything. Do so. Ashrin talked for an hour. Alaric listened, committing every detail to memory. When it was finished, he stood. Thank you for your cooperation, Lord Ashrin. Your execution is scheduled for dawn. It will be private. Your family will be spared. Your lands will be absorbed into the ducal estate. Your name will be removed from all records. In 50 years, no one will remember you existed. He turned and left. Behind him, Ashrin collapsed into sobs. Alaric did not look back. The executions were carried out quietly. No public announcements, no ceremonies. 4 bodies buried in unmarked graves. The militias in Kael's crossing dissolved within days. Without leadership or funding, the resistance evaporated. Alaric followed through on Seraphine's proposal. He publicly investigated the corrupt tax collectors, found them guilty, and had them flogged in the town square before stripping them of their positions. He reduced tax rates by 8% in the affected region and established a formal grievance process for future complaints. The population did not celebrate, but they stopped resisting. Stability returned. In the council chamber, Lady Marys approached Seraphine after a meeting. That was well done. Your proposal worked. Seraphine did not smile. It was necessary, not noble. Marys studied her. You do not seek credit. Credit is irrelevant. Results are not. Marys walked away, shaking her head. Seraphine gathered her notes and left the chamber. In the corridor, she found Duke Alaric waiting. Walk with me. She fell into step beside him. They moved through the citadel in silence, past servants and guards, who pressed themselves against walls to let them pass. They climbed the eastern tower and emerged onto the battlements. The wind was cold and sharp. Below, the sea hammered the cliffs. You solved a problem, Alaric said. That is noteworthy. You gave me the authority to propose solutions. That is more noteworthy. He turned to face her. Do you enjoy this? The work. The proximity to power. She considered the question. I find it clarifying. Power strips away pretense. People reveal themselves, including you. And what have I revealed? That you care more about order than justice. That you believe fear is more reliable than loyalty. That you are willing to do terrible things because you believe the alternative is worse. And that you are not as certain of those beliefs as you pretend to be. Alaric's expression did not change. You think I doubt myself. I think you question whether absolute control is sustainable, whether a system that depends entirely on your judgment can survive your eventual absence, whether you are building something that lasts or something that collapses the moment you are gone. He looked out over the cliffs. And if I am building something that collapses, then everything you have done, every decision, every sacrifice will be erased. Your legacy will not be order. It will be the chaos that follows when your control ends. A long silence. The wind howled. Then I suppose I cannot afford to die, Alaric said. No one can afford that. He glanced at her. You are remarkably cold for someone so young. I am remarkably realistic. Cold is a value judgment. I simply see things as they are. And what do you see when you look at me? She met his eyes. A man trying to hold back the tide by sheer force of will. It is impressive. It is also impossible. Nothing is impossible, Alaric said, only difficult. He turned and walked back toward the stairs. Seraphine stood alone on the battlements, watching the sea. Below, the waves crashed against stone, relentless and indifferent. She wondered how long the stone would hold. What? That night, as Seraphine worked in her chamber, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find a young servant, pale and trembling. Lady Lorne, Lord Theron requests your presence immediately. There has been an incident. What kind of incident? He did not say. Only that you must come now. She followed the servant through dimly lit corridors to a section of the citadel she had never entered. The walls here were older, the stones darker. They descended a narrow staircase and stopped before a heavy iron door. Theron stood outside, his face grim. Inside, he said quietly, "Do not speak unless the Duke addresses you directly." She entered. The room was small, lit by a single torch. In the center, Duke Alaric Varrington stood over a man kneeling on the floor, hands bound behind his back. The man's face was bloodied. His breath came in ragged gasps. Alaric glanced at Seraphine. This is Sir Edric Morven, one of my most trusted military advisors. He has just confessed to selling intelligence to the Riverland cartels. Seraphine said nothing. Alaric turned back to Edric. How long? Edric coughed, spitting blood. 2 years. And how much did they pay you? 30,000 gold marks. Alaric nodded slowly. 30,000. A reasonable price for treason. Tell me, Edric, what did you plan to do with that money? Leave. Start over somewhere far from here. Alaric crouched down, eye level with the broken man. You are going to abandon everything, your oaths, your position, your honor, for money. Edric looked up, tears streaming down his face. I had no choice. They threatened my family. If I did not cooperate, they would have killed them. Alaric finished. So you betrayed me to save them? Yes. And now your family will watch you die knowing you were a traitor. Was that the better outcome? Edric sobbed. Please. Your grace. Mercy. Alaric stood. Mercy is not something I grant. It is something you earn, and you have earned nothing. He drew a dagger from his belt, stepped forward, and drove it into Edric's heart. The man gasped once, then slumped forward. Alaric pulled the blade free and wiped it clean on the dead man's cloak. He turned to Seraphine. His expression was calm, almost serene. Your opinion. Her voice was steady, necessary. Alabor 8. He betrayed you. Betrayal within your inner circle is existential. If it is not punished immediately and absolutely, it signals tolerance. That would invite more betrayal. You had no choice. Alaric nodded. Correct. He gestured to the body. Have this removed. Theron stepped inside and motioned to 2 guards. They dragged the corpse out. Alaric and Seraphine stood alone in the blood-stained room. Does this disturb you? He asked. No. Why not? Because I understand the logic. You are not cruel for cruelty's sake. You are cruel because cruelty is the language your system speaks. If you showed weakness here, the entire structure would begin to fracture. I do not agree with the necessity of such a system, but I acknowledge its internal consistency. Alaric studied her. Most people would lie, pretend horror, express moral outrage. I am not most people. No, you are not. He walked past her toward the door, then paused. One day, Lady Lorne, you will face a choice between what is necessary and what is right. When that day comes, I will be curious to see which you choose. He left. Seraphine stood alone in the flickering torchlight, staring at the bloodstain spreading across the stone floor. She wondered if that day had already come, and she simply had not realized it yet. She wondered if that day had already come, and she simply had not realized it yet. The bloodstain on the stone floor looked black in the torchlight, spreading slowly toward the drain in the corner. Seraphine felt nothing, not disgust, not horror, just a clinical awareness that she had crossed a threshold and there was no map for the territory ahead. She left the room and walked through corridors that suddenly felt narrower. When she reached her chamber, she locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. She examined herself the way a surgeon examines a wound, looking for damage, finding none. That was what disturbed her most. Not what she had witnessed, but how little it had affected her. She understood the logic. That was the problem. Alaric had executed a traitor. Standard procedure. Necessary. Final. She had agreed with every step of the process because disagreement would have been irrational. But rationality was a cold country, and she was realizing she had been living there so long she no longer remembered what warmth felt like. A knock at the door. She opened it. Theron stood outside, holding a small wooden box. "The Duke instructed me to deliver this to you." She took the box. Theron left without another word. She closed the door and set the box on the desk. Inside was a key, a folded note, and a silver ring engraved with the ducal seal. She unfolded the note. "You have proven yourself capable. The key grants access to the Eastern Archives. The ring grants authority to act in my name within the Citadel walls. Use both wisely. Abuse either, and you will join Edric in the ground. No signature. None needed." Seraphine slipped the ring onto her finger. It was heavy. She stared at it for a long time, thinking about weight and what it meant to carry something you could not put down. The Eastern Archives occupied 3 floors of the oldest section of Blackstone Citadel. Few people had access. Ministers consulted it occasionally for legal precedent. Historians studied it rarely, and only with explicit permission. Seraphine descended the spiral staircase with the key in her hand and the ring on her finger, feeling like she was walking into a vault that contained not treasure but ammunition. The archive keeper was an ancient man named Lucien, bent and skeletal, with eyes that saw too much. He took her key without comment, verified the ring, and gestured toward the rows of shelves stretching into shadow. "What are you looking for?" "Everything the duchy does not want remembered." Lucien smiled, a thin and joyless expression. "Then you will be here for weeks. Start with the 3rd floor. The Consolidation War records. Your family is mentioned extensively." She climbed to the 3rd floor and found herself surrounded by leather-bound volumes, scrolls tied with faded ribbon, and parchment so old it crumbled at the edges. She pulled a volume labeled House Lorne, Investigation and Dissolution, and opened it carefully. The contents were worse than she expected. Her father had not simply conspired to assassinate the old duke. He had planned to fracture the entire duchy into independent holdings, each controlled by co-conspirators who would then wage war on each other for dominance. It was not treason. It was orchestrated collapse. The old duke had discovered the plot 3 days before the treaty negotiations and allowed it to proceed just far enough to identify every conspirator. Then he struck. Executions, expulsions, erasure. Her family had not been innocent victims. They had been architects of catastrophe, stopped only by a man more ruthless than they were. Seraphine closed the book. She felt hollow, not because her father had been a traitor, but because she had spent years believing he had been wronged, and that belief had been the foundation of everything she had built. Now the foundation was gone, and she was standing on air. She spent 3 days in the archives, reading everything, not just about her family, but about the duchy itself. The consolidation wars, the purges, the border disputes, the economic collapses narrowly averted, the rebellions crushed before they could spread. The entire bloody machinery of power laid bare in ink and parchment. By the 3rd night, she understood. Duke Alaric Varrington was not uniquely cruel. He was uniquely effective. His father had built the system. Alaric had perfected it. Every brutal decision, every ruthless calculation, every execution without trial was not aberration, but necessity. The duchy was surrounded by enemies. Internal fractures could become invasions. Weakness could become extinction. Alaric ruled the way he did because the alternative was collapse, and collapse meant death for everyone within these walls. She sat in the dim light of a single candle, surrounded by the ghosts of failed rebellions and crushed ambitions, and felt something shift inside her. Not sympathy, not agreement, just a cold recognition that she and Alaric were more alike than she wanted to admit. Both of them had learned that survival required clarity. Clarity required stripping away illusion. And once illusion was gone, all that remained was the raw machinery of cause and effect. She returned to her chamber as dawn broke. She did not sleep. She sat at her desk and wrote a new report. Not an assessment of ministers or policies, but a strategic analysis of the duchy's existential vulnerabilities. She identified 3 major threats: external pressure from rival territories seeking to exploit any perceived weakness, internal dissent from populations who obeyed through fear rather than investment, and structural brittleness caused by over-reliance on a single decision-maker whose death or incapacitation would create immediate power vacuum. She proposed solutions for all three. None of them were easy. All of them required Alaric to relinquish incremental control in exchange for distributed resilience. She knew he would resist, but she also knew he was intelligent enough to recognize truth when it was presented without decoration. She sealed the report and delivered it to Theron. Then she returned to her chamber and finally slept. When she woke, it was late afternoon. A servant had left food outside her door. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Then she dressed and walked to the council chamber. A meeting was scheduled. She arrived early and took her seat against the wall. Ministers filed in. Lady Mary's, Minister Vex, Sir Rowan, others whose names she had memorized but whose faces blurred together into a collective mask of competence and fear. Then Duke Alaric entered. The room fell silent. He sat at the head of the table and looked directly at Seraphine. Lady Lorne, step forward. She stood and approached the table. Every eye tracked her movement. Your latest report, Alaric said. Summarize it for the council. She did not hesitate. The duchy faces three existential threats: external rivals who will exploit any weakness, internal populations who obey through coercion rather than belief, and structural dependence on a single leader whose loss would create catastrophic power vacuum. To address these threats, I propose a three-part strategy. First, establish formal diplomatic channels with rival territories to reduce the cost of maintaining defensive posture. Second, implement economic and legal reforms that give local populations tangible stake in ducal stability. Third, create a formalized succession structure that ensures continuity of governance independent of any individual's survival. Silence. Then Sir Rowan spoke, his voice sharp. You are proposing we negotiate with enemies, appease the governed, and plan for the Duke's death. That is not strategy. That is capitulation. Seraphine turned to him. No. Capitulation is waiting until crisis forces action. Strategy is acting before crisis occurs. Right now, we are reactive. Every decision is made in response to immediate pressure. That makes us predictable. Predictability is exploitable. If we formalize diplomatic engagement, we control the terms. If we give populations investment, we reduce the cost of enforcement. If we establish succession protocols, we eliminate the single point of failure that makes this entire system vulnerable. Lady Maris leaned forward. And what happens when our enemies interpret diplomatic engagement as weakness? Then we remind them that engagement is not weakness. It is efficiency. War is expensive. Diplomacy is cheap. We lose nothing by talking. We lose everything by assuming every neighbor is an enemy that must be crushed preemptively. Minister Vex spoke next. And the reforms you propose, giving populations stake in ducal stability, that requires relinquishing control. The Duke's authority is absolute. Compromise weakens that authority. Seraphine met his eyes. Authority is not weakened by acknowledging reality. It is weakened by pretending reality does not exist. Right now, people obey because they are afraid. Fear works, but it is exhausting. It requires constant enforcement. It creates resentment that accumulates over time. If we give them reasons to support the system beyond fear, we reduce enforcement cost and increase stability. That is not weakness. That is optimization. Alaric raised a hand. The room fell silent. He looked at Seraphine and the succession structure. Explain. She took a breath. If you die tomorrow, this duchy fractures. There is no formal heir, no established protocol, no clear line of authority. Every ambitious noble will see opportunity. The result will be civil war. Not because people want chaos, but because there is no alternative. If we establish formal succession now, we eliminate that vulnerability. It does not reduce your authority. It extends it beyond your lifetime. Alaric leaned back. You're asking me to plan for my own obsolescence. I am asking you to plan for your legacy. Everything you have built collapses the moment you are gone unless you build something that survives you. Right now, you are not building a system. You are building a dictatorship. Dictatorships die with their dictators. Systems endure. Sir Rowan stood abruptly. This is treason. She is suggesting the Duke is mortal, that his authority is temporary, that the entire structure of ducal governance is flawed. She should be removed from this council immediately. Alaric did not move. Sit down, Rowan. Your Grace, I must protest. Sit down. Rowan sat, face flushed with anger. Alaric turned back to Seraphine. Your proposals are radical, dangerous, and possibly correct. He stood. We will reconvene in 3 days. In that time, I want detailed plans for each proposal. Diplomatic protocols, reform structures, succession frameworks. If they are viable, we implement them. If they are not, we discard them. Lady Lorne, you will coordinate with the relevant ministers to develop these plans. Ministers, you will cooperate fully or explain your objections in writing. Dismissed. The room emptied quickly. Seraphine remained standing. Alaric walked to the window and stared out over the citadel grounds. You realize what you have done. She joined him at the window. I have given you options. You have challenged the foundation of my rule in front of the entire council. That cannot be undone. It was not meant to be undone. It was meant to be confronted. He glanced at her. You are either very brave or very stupid. I am neither. I am necessary. He almost smiled. That remains to be seen. She left him standing at the window, watching the citadel move through its daily rituals. Outside, servants carried supplies. Guards patrolled walls. Merchants negotiated contracts. The machine continued, indifferent to the conversation that had just occurred, unaware that the blueprints were being redrawn. Over the next 3 days, Seraphine worked without sleep. She coordinated with ministers who resented her presence, drafted protocols that upended centuries of tradition, and built frameworks for a duchy that did not yet exist but might if Alaric could be convinced to risk everything he had built for the possibility of something that might endure. Lady Maris was cautiously supportive. She understood that economic reform reduced long-term costs even if it required short-term investment. Minister Vex was openly hostile. He saw any concession to local populations as erosion of central authority. Sir Rowan refused to participate entirely, sending a written objection that amounted to a declaration that the entire proposal was treasonous fantasy. Seraphine ignored the objections and focused on the work. She drafted diplomatic protocols that established formal communication channels without conceding territorial claims. She designed economic reforms that gave local leaders limited budgetary authority in exchange for meeting performance benchmarks. She built succession frameworks that formalized lines of authority while preserving ducal supremacy. When the 3 days ended, she delivered a report that was 140 pages long. She handed it to Theron and collapsed into bed, sleeping for 16 hours straight. When she woke, Alaric was sitting in a chair in her room. She sat up, disoriented. Your Grace! He held up the report. I read it, and it is the most dangerous document ever written within these walls. If implemented, it would fundamentally alter the structure of ducal governance. It would reduce my absolute authority in exchange for distributed stability. It would transform this duchy from a dictatorship into something resembling a constitutional system. It would make me less powerful individually and the duchy more resilient collectively. She said nothing. He set the report on the desk. It is also correct. Every analysis, every proposal, every conclusion. You are right. The system I have built is brittle. It depends entirely on my capacity to enforce control. The moment I falter, it collapses. If I implement your proposals, I reduce that vulnerability. But I also reduce my power. That is not a trivial trade. Power is not the same as control, Seraphine said quietly. Right now you have control. But control is exhausting. It requires constant enforcement. If you trade incremental control for systemic resilience, you do not lose power. You transform it. You stop being the man who holds everything together through sheer force of will and become the architect of a system that holds itself together. That is not weakness. That is evolution. Alaric stood and walked to the window. Dawn was breaking. Light spilled across the citadel, painting stone in shades of gold and gray. He spoke without turning. If I do this, there is no going back. Once I concede that the system can exist without absolute central authority, I cannot reclaim that authority without destroying the system itself. I will have created something that limits me permanently. Yes. And you believe that is necessary. I believe it is inevitable. The question is whether you control the transition or it controls you. He turned. You are asking me to trust that distributed power will not fracture into chaos. That people given autonomy will use it responsibly. That formal structures will replace personal authority without collapse. That is a tremendous amount of faith in human nature. I am asking you to trust structures, not people. People are unreliable. Structures endure. You built one structure. Now build another, one that survives you. He studied her for a long moment. And what do you get from this? Nothing. Everything I propose reduces my influence. If authority is distributed, I become unnecessary. If succession is formalized, I lose proximity to power. If the system becomes self-sustaining, I am obsolete. Then why propose it? Because I did not come here to accumulate power. I came here to understand it. And what I have learned is that real power is not control, it is creation. You can control a duchy for as long as you live, or you can create a duchy that lasts for generations. One makes you powerful, the other makes you immortal. Alaric smiled, genuinely this time. You are a dangerous woman, Lady Lorne. So I have been told. He picked up the report. I will implement this. Not immediately, not all at once, but incrementally. We begin with diplomatic protocols. If those succeed, we move to economic reforms. If those succeed, we address succession. Each step will be tested. Each success will justify the next. Failure at any stage halts the entire process. Agreed. Agreed. Good. Now get out of bed. We have work to do. He left. Seraphine sat alone in the growing light, feeling something she had not felt in years. Not hope. Hope was naive. But possibility. The sense that the architecture of power was not fixed, that it could be redesigned, that control and resilience were not opposites but complementary forces. She dressed quickly and followed him. The implementation began quietly. Alaric dispatched envoys to neighboring territories with formal proposals for diplomatic exchange. Not treaties, not alliances, just communication. The responses were cautious but not hostile. Minor nobles from rival duchies agreed to preliminary discussions. Borders remained closed, but letters began moving across them. Internally, Alaric announced economic reforms. Local councils in 3 pilot regions were granted limited budgetary authority to manage infrastructure and services. Performance metrics were established. Success would be rewarded with expanded authority. Failure would result in immediate reversion to central control. The court reacted with confusion and suspicion. Ministers who had spent careers executing ducal orders without question suddenly found themselves advising on frameworks they did not understand. Some adapted, others resisted. Sir Rowan became increasingly vocal in his opposition, arguing in council meetings that every concession was a step toward collapse. Alaric tolerated the dissent for exactly 2 weeks. Then he called Rowan into his study. Seraphine was present. She had not been invited, but Alaric had stopped dismissing her from private meetings. She sat in the corner, silent and observant. Rowan entered stiffly, his face set in disapproval. Your Grace, you summoned me. I did. Alaric gestured to the chair. Sit. Rowan sat. I assume this is about my objections to the reform process. It is. You have made your position clear. You believe the reforms weaken central authority. You believe they invite chaos. You believe I am making a catastrophic mistake. Rowan nodded. I do. And you believe this strongly enough to undermine implementation. Rowan stiffened. I am not undermining anything. I am voicing legitimate concerns through proper channels. You are poisoning the well. Every time a minister expresses doubt, you validate it. Every time a reform encounters resistance, you amplify it. You are not protecting the duchy. You are sabotaging it. Your Grace, with respect, I am trying to protect the duchy from itself. These reforms are untested. They assume cooperation from populations that have only ever known coercion. They assume our enemies will not exploit our openness. They assume structures can replace leadership. Those are dangerous assumptions. Alaric leaned forward, then proposed alternatives. Rowan blinked. What? You claim my approach is flawed. Propose a better one. Give me a strategy that addresses the duchy's vulnerabilities without requiring the reforms you oppose. Show me how to prevent civil war upon my death. Show me how to reduce enforcement costs without giving populations stake. Show me how to maintain defensive posture without exhausting resources. Propose alternatives or stop obstructing. Rowan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The current system has functioned for decades and will collapse the moment I am gone. That is not a defense. That is an admission. Your Grace, I am a soldier. I enforce your will. I do not design policy. Then do not obstruct those who do. He stood. You're relieved of your council position. You will retain your military command, but you will no longer participate in governance discussions. If you cannot support the reforms, you will at minimum not sabotage them. Dismissed. Rowan stood, face pale. Your Grace, I have served this duchy for 20 years, and you will continue to serve. In the capacity that suits your skills, your loyalty is not in question. Your judgment is. Leave. Rowan left. The door closed behind him. Alaric turned to Seraphine. Your opinion. Necessary. He was becoming a focal point for resistance. Removing him from the council eliminates that focal point without alienating his military supporters. And if he resents this decision enough to become a threat, then you execute him. But I do not think he will. Rowan is loyal to the idea of the duchy. He disagrees with your methods, but he does not want to destroy you. He will grumble. He will complain, but he will obey. Alaric nodded. Let us hope you are correct. Mamkot. The reforms continued. Diplomatic exchanges expanded. Local councils in the pilot regions reported modest successes. Infrastructure improved. Tax collection became more efficient. Complaints decreased. The system was working. Then the first real test arrived. A border province called Merivale experienced a crop failure. Local reserves were insufficient. The regional council requested emergency grain shipments from the central ducal stores. Under the old system, Alaric would have approved or denied the request personally. Under the new system, the regional council had authority to make the decision independently, provided they met performance metrics and stayed within budget. The council approved the shipment. Grain moved from central stores to Merivale. The population was fed, crisis averted. Then the harvest reports came in. The central stores were now below minimum reserve thresholds. If another crisis occurred, the duchy would be unable to respond without purchasing grain at inflated prices from external suppliers. In the council chamber, Minister Vex seized the opportunity. Your Grace, this is precisely the danger I warned about. The regional council prioritized local needs over ducal stability. We are now vulnerable because we distributed authority to people who lack the perspective to make strategic decisions. Alaric looked at Seraphine. Response. She stood. The regional council acted within their authority. They faced an immediate crisis and resolved it using available resources. The fact that central reserves are now below threshold is not a failure of distributed authority. It is a failure of reserve planning. We should have anticipated regional shortfalls and maintained higher central reserves. The solution is not to revoke regional authority. It is to adjust reserve protocols to account for distributed decision-making. Vex scoffed. Adjust reserve protocols. Do you have any idea how much that would cost? Less than allowing a population to starve and dealing with the resulting rebellion. But if cost is your concern, consider this. The regional council resolved the crisis efficiently without requiring your involvement. That saved time. Time is a resource. If we had waited for central approval, the crisis would have worsened. The regional council acted correctly. Our reserve planning was inadequate. Fix the planning. Do not punish the council. Alaric tapped his fingers on the table. Lady Lorne is correct. The regional council followed protocol. We failed to anticipate the consequences of distributed decision-making on central resources. That is a structural issue, not a personnel issue. Minister Vex, you will draft revised reserve protocols that account for regional autonomy. Submit them by the end of the week. If they are adequate, we implement them. If they are not, I will find someone who can produce adequate work. Dismissed. Vex bowed stiffly and left. The other ministers followed. Seraphine remained. That was close, Alaric said. It was inevitable. Every structural change produces unforeseen consequences. The question is whether we adapt or retreat. You chose to adapt. That is why the system will survive. And if the next consequence is catastrophic, then we mitigate catastrophe. That is what governance is, constant mitigation. You were doing it before, you are doing it now. The difference is that now you are building something that continues when you stop. He looked at her. You truly believe this will work. I believe it is the only option. The alternative is maintaining absolute control until you die, at which point everything collapses. This way, you might actually leave something behind. He stood and walked to the window. Below, the citadel moved through its evening routines. Lights flickered in windows. Guards changed shifts. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled. "I never wanted a legacy," Alaric said quietly. "I wanted order." Legacy is vanity. Order is necessity. They are not exclusive. Order that ends with you is temporary. Order that survives you is legacy. You can have both. He turned. "And what do you want, Lady Lorne?" She met his eyes. "To see if power can be remade. To see if control can become creation. To see if you are capable of building something that does not require you. And if I am not, then I was wrong about you. And I will leave." He smiled. "You would abandon me. I would abandon a failed experiment. You are not indispensable. No one is. That is the point." He laughed, a genuine sound of surprised amusement. "You are the most insufferable person I have ever met, and yet here I am. Yes, here you are." They stood in silence, watching the citadel settle into night. Somewhere below, decisions were being made without ducal oversight, local councils managing resources, regional leaders resolving disputes, structures functioning independently. For the first time in 15 years, Duke Alaric Varrington felt something he had not expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, but curiosity. The sense that the system he had built was becoming something he had not designed, and that transformation might not be catastrophe, it might be evolution. 6 months passed. The reforms expanded. More regions received local authority. Diplomatic exchanges produced preliminary trade agreements. The succession framework was drafted and presented to the council, though implementation remained theoretical. Then everything fractured. A messenger arrived at dawn, bloodied and exhausted. He collapsed in the throne room, gasping out a single sentence before losing consciousness. "Treason." In the inner circle, Alaric stood over him, face carved from stone. Theron was summoned. The messenger was revived long enough to deliver his full report. Evidence had been discovered in the eastern provinces, documents, letters, payments, all pointing to a coordinated conspiracy within Alaric's closest advisors. Not to assassinate him. Worse, to dismantle the reforms, to restore absolute ducal control, to eliminate anyone who threatened traditional power structures. The conspiracy involved 3 ministers, Lady Maris Caldane, Minister Oren Vex, and Lord Castor Theron. Seraphine stood in the throne room, listening to the report, feeling the floor drop away beneath her. Theron, the man who had introduced her to Alaric, the man who had facilitated every meeting, every document, every step of her integration into the inner circle. Theron was a traitor. Alaric's voice was ice. "Arrest them, all 3. Immediate detention, no contact, no visitors, total isolation." Guards moved quickly. Within the hour, all 3 were in those holding cells beneath the citadel. Alaric descended the stairs alone. Seraphine followed without invitation. He did not dismiss her. They stopped outside Theron's cell. The old chamberlain sat on the stone bench, hands folded, expression calm. "Your Grace, I have been expecting you." Alaric stared at him through the iron bars. "Explain." Theron stood slowly. "There is nothing to explain. You already know. I conspired to undo your reforms, to restore the system that kept this duchy stable for generations, to eliminate the influence of those who convinced you to weaken what should never be weakened. Why? Because you are destroying everything your father built. Everything you built. You are distributing power to people who do not understand it. You are negotiating with enemies who will exploit your openness. You are planning for succession as if you are not immortal in purpose. You're wrong, and someone had to stop you." Alaric stepped closer to the bars. "And you believed you were that someone. I believed I was loyal to the duchy, to the idea of absolute authority that protects rather than compromises, to the system that has kept us alive while lesser territories collapsed into chaos. Loyal." Alaric's voice dropped to something colder than winter. "You betrayed me. You conspired behind my back. You planned to dismantle reforms that I implemented. That is not loyalty. That is treason." Theron met his eyes. "No, Your Grace. Treason is abandoning the principles that made you powerful. I am guilty only of trying to save you from yourself." Alaric turned to Seraphine. "Your assessment." She stepped forward. "He believes he is right. That makes him more dangerous than someone motivated by greed or ambition." True believers do not compromise. They martyr themselves and inspire others. If you execute him publicly, you create a symbol. If you execute him privately, you create a mystery. Either way, you validate his position. The conspiracy becomes legend. Then what do you propose? Do not execute him. Exile him. Strip him of title and position. Send him far from here with just enough resources to survive, but not enough to rebuild. Let him live with the knowledge that he failed. That is a worse punishment than death. And it eliminates martyrdom. Alaric considered this. Then he looked back at Theron. You have served me for 20 years. That service earned you this: exile instead of execution. You will be escorted to the border by dawn. You will take nothing but the clothes you wear. If you ever return to this duchy, you will be killed on sight. If you speak of what occurred here, your family will answer for your words. Do you understand? Theron's face remained impassive. I understand. Good. Enjoy your mercy. It is more than you deserve. Alaric turned and walked away. Seraphine followed. Behind them, Theron sat back down on the stone bench, expression unreadable. At the top of the stairs, Alaric stopped. Lady Maris and Minister Vex. What about them? Seraphine thought carefully. Maris was coerced. Vex was complicit. Different motivations, different consequences. Maris should be given the opportunity to prove loyalty through action. Vex should be executed. He acted from conviction, not fear. He will never stop resisting. Alaric nodded slowly. Arrange it, she did. Lady Maris was brought to the throne room in chains. Alaric offered her a choice. Prove loyalty by overseeing the next phase of reforms with ruthless efficiency, or face execution for conspiracy. Maris chose loyalty. She was released, stripped of previous authority, and assigned direct oversight of the most challenging regional implementations. Failure would mean death. Success would mean redemption. Minister Oren Vex was executed at dawn in the courtyard. No ceremony, no audience, just a swift blade and a shallow grave. His name was struck from all records. By midday, the conspirators were gone. The reforms continued, but something had changed. Alaric stood in his study, staring at the map of the duchy on the wall, and for the first time felt the weight of what he was attempting. Not just structural reform, complete transformation. He was dismantling the system that had defined his rule and replacing it with something untested, unproven, and entirely dependent on the possibility that structures could outlast individuals. Seraphine entered without knocking. She stood beside him, following his gaze across the map. You are wondering if this is worth it. I am wondering if I am building my own obsolescence. You are. That is the point. And if the system collapses after I am gone, then you will be dead and it will not matter to you. But the people who survive will have a chance to rebuild on foundations you created. That is more than most rulers leave behind. He glanced at her. You are not troubled by the conspiracy. I am troubled that it took this long to surface. But I am not surprised. Change threatens those who benefit from stasis. Theron benefited from absolute central authority. Your reforms eliminated that benefit. His reaction was predictable, and yet you did not predict it. I predicted resistance. I underestimated its organization. That is a failure of intelligence, not logic. Alaric turned fully to face her. You have become indispensable. No, I have become useful. There is a difference. Is there? Yes. Indispensable people become targets. Useful people become tools. Tools can be replaced. Targets must be eliminated. And which do you prefer to be? Useful. Always. He studied her. What do you want from all of this, Lady Lorne? You have rebuilt my duchy from the inside. You have dismantled centuries of tradition. You have made yourself essential to the most powerful man in the region. And yet you claim to want nothing. I do not believe you. Seraphine met his gaze without flinching. I want to see if it is possible to remake power without violence, to transform control into creation, to prove that systems can endure beyond individuals. That is not ambition, it is curiosity. And when your curiosity is satisfied, then I leave. Just like that, just like that. Alaric shook his head slowly. You are lying, perhaps, but not about this. He turned back to the map. Then we continue. The reforms expand. Diplomatic relationships formalize. Succession protocols are implemented. And we see if your grand experiment succeeds, or if we both end up erased from history as fools who believed structures could replace strength. Seraphine stood beside him, staring at the map. You will not be erased. You will be remembered as the Duke who transformed a dictatorship into a system. That is immortality. Or catastrophe, often the same thing. He laughed quietly. Outside, the citadel moved through its routines, unaware that the foundations beneath it were shifting, that the architecture of power was being redesigned in real time, and that the man who had ruled through absolute control was learning to rule through something else entirely. Whether that something was wisdom or weakness remained to be seen. Duchess. 3 weeks later, the formal succession document was signed. Duke Alaric Barrington designated a council of regents to govern in the event of his death until a permanent successor could be identified through structured process. The council included regional leaders, military commanders, and economic ministers. No single individual held majority authority. Decisions required consensus. The document was sealed and placed in the Eastern Archives. Copies were distributed to every major house in the duchy. The act was revolutionary. For the first time in the duchy's history, power was codified as transferable through process, rather than bloodline or force. The reaction was immediate. Some nobles praised the clarity. Others condemned it as weakness. A few began quietly positioning themselves for the eventual power struggle they believed was inevitable. Alaric ignored all of it. He convened the council and delivered a single statement. This duchy will outlast me. That is not weakness. It is design. Anyone who interprets it otherwise will discover that my authority remains absolute while I live. Test me, and you join the long list of people who believed I could be undermined. Dismissed. No one tested him. That night, Seraphine found Alaric on the battlements, staring out over the sea. She joined him in silence. They stood together, watching waves crash against cliffs that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. You did it, she said quietly. I signed a document. That is not achievement. Achievement is when the system survives my death. It will. You cannot know that. No, but I believe it. And belief has value. He glanced at her. When did you become an optimist? I am not an optimist. I am a pragmatist who has seen what you built. You created something that does not depend on you. That is the definition of success. Alaric turned back to the sea. Or the definition of obsolescence. They are the same thing. He smiled. Perhaps. They stood in silence as night deepened around them. Below, the citadel glowed with torchlight, a constellation of human effort and ambition and survival. Somewhere in that light, decisions were being made without ducal oversight. Structures were functioning independently. The machine was learning to run itself. Duke Alaric Barrington had spent 15 years building absolute control. Now he was learning to let go. Not because he wanted to, but because he understood that holding on too tightly would crush what he was trying to preserve. Seraphine had taught him that. She had walked into his fortress and refused to kneel, and in refusing, she had shown him that power was not the same as strength, that control was not the same as creation, and that legacy required sacrifice. He did not thank her. Thanks implied debt. They were beyond debt. They were partners in an experiment neither fully understood but both believed was necessary. Tomorrow, the work would continue. Reforms would expand. Diplomatic relationships would deepen. Succession protocols would be tested. The duchy would evolve or collapse, and the only certainty was that standing still was no longer an option. But tonight they stood together on the battlements, watching the sea, and for the first time in either of their lives, they felt something neither had words for. Not hope, not satisfaction, but the cold, clear recognition that they had reached a point of no return. The architecture of power had been redrawn. The foundations had shifted, and there was no going back to what they had been before this collision began. The duchy would survive Duke Alaric Barrington. That was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. The only question remaining was what that survival would cost. And neither of them knew the answer. That uncertainty should have been a warning. In the architecture of power, certainty is the only foundation that holds. The moment doubt creeps in, the entire structure becomes vulnerable to forces you cannot see until they have already struck. Alaric and Seraphine stood on the battlements believing they had redesigned the system, believing control could become creation, believing legacy was within reach. They were wrong. Not about the theory, about the people who would never let that theory survive. The first sign came 3 days later. A minor incident. A regional council in the southern province submitted a budgetary report that exceeded approved allocations by 12%. Standard procedure required immediate investigation. Lady Maris, now overseeing regional implementations as her path to redemption, dispatched auditors. They arrived to find the council chambers empty, documents burned, officials missing. Maris reported this to Alaric in the throne room. Seraphine was present, as she always was now. The dynamic between them had shifted from advisor and ruler to something harder to define, partners in reconstruction. Architects standing over blueprints neither fully trusted. Alaric listened to Maris without expression. How many missing? 7 council members. 3 administrative officials. All disappeared within a 12-hour window. Evidence of coercion. None. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. They vanished as if they planned it. Seraphine leaned forward slightly, or as if someone planned it for them. This was not spontaneous. Simultaneous disappearance requires coordination. Someone orchestrated this. To what end? Alaric said. Unknown. But the timing is not coincidental. This occurred immediately after the succession document was distributed. Someone is testing response protocols. They want to see how we react to coordinated disruption. Alaric stood. Send military investigators. I want those officials found within 48 hours, dead or alive. If they fled voluntarily, they answer for desertion. If they were taken, we find who took them and eliminate the threat. Maris, coordinate with Sir Rowan. Full resource allocation. Maris bowed. Yes, Your Grace. She left quickly. Seraphine remained. This is not an isolated incident. Alaric turned to her. Explain. The conspiracy Therion led was discovered too easily. Evidence was accessible. Confessions were immediate. Real conspiracies do not expose themselves. They burrow deep and strike when you believe the threat is past. Therion was a distraction. The real conspiracy is still active, and this disappearance is the opening move. You believe Therion was sacrificed. I believe Therion believed he was leading, but someone else was coordinating, someone who let him take the fall while they continued building, and now they are ready to act. Alaric walked to the window. Below, the citadel moved through its routines. Guards on walls, servants in courtyards, merchants negotiating contracts. Everything appeared normal. That was how collapse always began, with the illusion of normalcy maintained until the moment it shattered. If you are correct, who is coordinating? Someone with access. Someone who understands the reforms well enough to exploit their vulnerabilities. Someone who benefits from chaos. Alaric turned back. That describes half the nobility. Then we narrow the list. Who had access to Therion? Who knew the conspiracy details? Who was close enough to observe implementation, but distant enough to avoid suspicion? They spent 3 hours analyzing records, cross-referencing access logs, identifying patterns. By evening, they had a list of 12 names, minor nobles, administrative officials, all positioned at critical junctures in the reform infrastructure. Alaric summoned his intelligence network. Surveillance was activated on all 12. Communications monitored. Movements tracked. Within 24 hours, patterns emerged. 7 of the 12 were meeting secretly in rotating locations. Conversations were coded, documents were exchanged, money changed hands. The network was larger than Therion's conspiracy. It was also more sophisticated. These were not loyalists trying to restore old systems. These were opportunists trying to seize power during transition. They understood that reformation created vulnerability. Windows of chaos where authority was distributed but not yet solidified. They intended to exploit that window before it closed. Alaric convened an emergency council session. Only his most trusted remained. Lady Maris, 3 regional commanders, and Seraphine. He laid out the evidence. We are facing coordinated insurrection, not rebellion, not resistance. Calculated seizure. Multiple factions are positioning to claim authority during the transition period established by the succession protocols. They believe distributed power means weakened power. They intend to fracture the duchy into independent territories under their control. One of the commanders spoke. Your Grace, if we move against them now, we risk triggering the very chaos they are trying to create. Mass arrests will destabilize regions already adapting to new governance structures. Seraphine cut in. And if we wait, they consolidate. The moment they believe coordination is sufficient, they strike simultaneously across multiple provinces. Regional councils collapse. Local militias are overwhelmed. By the time central authority can respond, the duchy is already fractured. Then what do you propose? The commander said. Surgical elimination. We do not arrest. We do not announce. We remove the coordination nodes silently and immediately. 7 key figures, all eliminated within the same 12-hour window. No trials. No explanations. They simply cease to exist. The network fragments because communication collapses. Without coordination, opportunists become isolated actors. Isolated actors can be managed. The room fell silent. Lady Maris looked ill. The commanders exchanged glances. Finally, one spoke. Your Grace, that is execution without due process. It violates the legal frameworks we just established. Alaric's voice was cold. The legal frameworks assume stability. We do not have stability. We have a knife at the throat of everything we built. Due process is a luxury afforded during peace. This is not peace. This is war conducted in shadows. And in war, hesitation is death. He turned to Seraphine. Assemble the list. Confirm targets only. I want locations, movement patterns, optimal elimination windows. Deliver it within 6 hours. She stood immediately. Understood. The council was dismissed. Seraphine returned to her chamber and began cross-referencing intelligence reports with logistical data. She worked with mechanical precision. Emotions locked away because emotions were distractions, and distractions were fatal. By midnight, the list was complete. 7 names, 7 locations, 7 windows of opportunity. She delivered it to Alaric in his study. He read it twice, then looked up. You are certain as intelligence allows. And you believe this is necessary. I believe this is survival. The question is whether you are willing to do what survival requires. He set the document down. If I do this, I become everything I claim to evolve beyond: absolute authority, unilateral execution, the very system we are trying to dismantle. No, you become pragmatic. Systems require time to solidify. We do not have time, so we buy time with blood. Once the threat is eliminated, the system continues. But if the threat eliminates us first, there is no system, only chaos. Alaric stood and walked to the fire. Flames cast shadows across his face, carving lines deeper than age. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. I wanted to believe power could be remade without violence, that transformation could occur through structure rather than force. You convinced me it was possible. And now you are telling me the only way to preserve that possibility is to revert to the methods I was trying to abandon. I'm telling you that transformation is not a single event. It is a process. And processes require protection. You are not abandoning your principles. You are defending them long enough for them to take root. There is a difference. Is there? Yes. Because after this, you return to the system. You do not remain in the shadows. This is not who you are becoming. This is what you must do to ensure who you are becoming survives. He turned. And if I am wrong, if this creates more chaos than it prevents, then we adapt, as we always have. He studied her for a long moment. You have changed me, Lady Lorne. I am not certain that is a good thing. Change is not good or bad. It is inevitable. The only choice is whether you control it or it controls you. He smiled faintly. You sound like me again. Then you are learning. Or you are. He picked up the document. The executions will occur at dawn. Silent, simultaneous, no survivors. By midday, the conspiracy will be decapitated and the duchy will never know how close it came to collapse. Seraphine bowed slightly and turned to leave. Lady Lorne. She stopped. After this, we cannot go back. Whatever we are building, it will be built on bodies. That is the foundation. 7 more names added to a list that already stretches back generations. Are you prepared to carry that weight? She looked back at him. I have been carrying it since the day I walked into this citadel. The question is whether you are prepared to share it. He held her gaze. I suppose we will find out. She left. Alaric sat alone in the flickering firelight, holding a document that contained 7 death sentences delivered with clinical precision. He had killed before. Many times. But always as the Duke enforcing law. This was different. This was the Duke protecting a system that might not survive without protection. The distinction felt thinner than it should. He signed the execution orders and sealed them. Then he poured a glass of wine and drank it slowly, staring into the fire, wondering if transformation always required this much blood, or if he was simply bad at evolution. The executions occurred exactly as planned. 7 targets, 7 locations, 7 silent eliminations conducted by operatives who specialized in making problems disappear. By dawn, all 7 were dead. No witnesses, no evidence. The bodies would never be found. The names would be erased from records. Within a week, even their families would stop asking questions because questions attracted attention, and attention was dangerous. The conspiracy fractured immediately. Without coordination nodes, the network collapsed into isolated factions. Some tried to continue independently. They were identified and removed with equal efficiency. Others fled the duchy entirely. Within 3 weeks, the threat was eliminated. The reforms continued. Regional councils operated without disruption. Diplomatic relationships deepened. The succession framework remained intact. To anyone observing from outside, the duchy appeared stable, functional, evolving smoothly. But inside Blackstone Citadel, something had broken. Not structurally, psychologically. Alaric moved through his routines with mechanical precision, but his eyes were distant. He spoke less in council meetings. His decisions remained sharp, but the certainty behind them felt performative rather than genuine. Seraphine noticed. She always noticed. One evening, she found him in the eastern tower, staring out over the cliffs. She joined him without speaking. They stood in silence for several minutes before he broke it. I executed 7 people to protect a system designed to prevent me from executing people without due process. Do you see the contradiction? I see pragmatism. You protected the system long enough for it to solidify. Now it can function as designed. And the 7 were threats. You neutralize threats. That is governance. No. Governance is law. What I did was murder justified by necessity. There is a difference. Only in terminology. He turned to face her. Do you feel nothing? 7 lives ended on our order. 7 families destroyed. 7 absences that will echo for generations. Does that not disturb you? She met his eyes without flinching. It disturbs me that it was necessary. It does not disturb me that we did it. The alternative was collapse. Collapse would have killed thousands. We chose 7 over thousands. That is not murder. That is mathematics. Mathematics? He laughed bitterly. Is that what we have become? Calculators weighing bodies against outcomes. Yes. That is exactly what we have become. That is what power is, constant calculation. You knew this before I arrived. You have been calculating your entire rule. The only difference now is that you are aware of it. And awareness makes it worse. Awareness makes it honest. He looked back out over the cliffs. The sea churned below, relentless and indifferent. I wanted to build something better. Something that did not require this. You are building something better. But better does not mean bloodless. Every system is built on foundations that include compromises you wish you did not have to make. The question is whether those compromises serve a purpose beyond themselves. Yours do. That has to be enough. Does it? It has to be. Because the alternative is paralysis. And paralysis kills faster than decisiveness. They stood in silence. Wind howled through the tower. Below, the citadel glowed with torchlight, unaware of the conversation occurring above it, unaware of the 7 bodies buried in unmarked graves, unaware that the stability they enjoyed was purchased with blood they would never see. Alaric spoke quietly. I am tired, Lady Lorne. Not physically, but of carrying this, of being the one who decides who lives and who dies, of building systems that require constant vigilance to prevent collapse. I am tired of being necessary. Then make yourself unnecessary. Finalize the succession protocols. Distribute authority completely. Step back. And if the system collapses without me, then it was never a system. It was a dictatorship with better paperwork. But I do not believe it will collapse. I believe you have built something that can endure. The question is whether you trust it enough to let go. He turned to her. And what about you? When I step back, what happens to your role? I leave. As I always said I would. Just like that. Just like that. He studied her. I do not believe you. Then do not. But watch me do it anyway. She turned and walked toward the stairs. Alaric watched her go, then looked back out over the cliffs, letting go. The concept was simple. The execution was impossible. He had spent 15 years building absolute control. Releasing it felt like stepping off a cliff and hoping structures would catch him before he hit the rocks below. But Seraphine was right, as always. If he did not trust the system enough to release control, then he had not built a system. He had built a cage, and he was as trapped inside it as everyone else. 2 months later, the formal transition began. Alaric convened the full council and announced his intention to gradually transfer daily governance to the Regent Council while retaining emergency override authority. The transition would occur over 6 months. Regional authority would be finalized. Diplomatic relationships would be codified. Economic oversight would be distributed. By the end of the period, Duke Alaric Varrington would remain the formal head of state, but the duchy would function independently of his direct involvement. The reaction was mixed. Some nobles celebrated, others panicked. A few began positioning for the power vacuum they believed was inevitable. Alaric ignored all of it. He had made his decision. Now he would implement it with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything else. Seraphine coordinated the transition. She drafted protocols, established oversight mechanisms, built redundancies into every system. She worked 18-hour days, sleeping in brief intervals, eating when reminded, existing in a state of focused intensity that made everyone around her nervous. Lady Maris approached her one evening in the archives. "You are going to collapse if you do not rest." Seraphine did not look up from the document she was annotating. "Rest is for after." "After what?" "After this is finished." "And when is it finished?" Seraphine set down her pen. "When the system functions without me. When the duchy operates independently. When I am no longer necessary." "And then what?" "Then I leave." Maris sat down across from her. "You love him." Seraphine's expression did not change. "Irrelevant." "Is it?" "Yes. Love is a complication. This is about completion. I came here to see if power could be remade. The answer is yes, but only through constant pressure. I have applied that pressure. Now the structure is solidifying. My role is ending. And you feel nothing about that. I feel satisfied. The work is nearly complete. That is enough." Maris shook her head. "You're lying to yourself. I have watched you and the Duke for months. The way you speak without words. The way you anticipate each other. The way you have rebuilt this entire duchy together. That is not professional collaboration. That is partnership. And you are walking away from it because you are afraid. Afraid of what? Of needing something you cannot control." Seraphine stood abruptly. "This conversation is over." She left. Maris sat alone in the archives, shaking her head. Some people spent their entire lives running from connection because connection was vulnerability. And vulnerability was the one thing they could not tolerate. Seraphine had remade an entire duchy, but could not allow herself to stay in it. That night, Seraphine returned to her chamber and found Alaric waiting inside. She stopped in the doorway. "Your Grace, this is irregular. We are past formality, Lady Lorne. Sit." She closed the door and sat. He remained standing, looking out the narrow window at the night sky. "I spoke with Lady Maris. She believes you are leaving not because the work is complete, but because you are afraid of what staying would mean." Lady Maris oversteps. "Does she?" "Yes." He turned to face her. "I'm going to ask you a direct question. I expect a direct answer. Ask. Do you want to leave?" The question hung in the air between them. Seraphine felt something shift inside her chest. Not panic, not fear. Something deeper. A recognition that the answer mattered more than she wanted to admit. Want is irrelevant. I said I would leave when the work was complete. The work is nearly complete. I will leave. That is not an answer. That is deflection. I asked what you want. She stood, suddenly needing distance. What I want does not matter. I came here with a purpose. That purpose is fulfilled. Staying beyond that point serves no function. No function. He stepped closer. You have rebuilt this duchy from the inside. You have transformed governance structures that stood for centuries. You have become essential to everything we have created. And you claim staying serves no function. I claim that staying past necessity creates dependency. Dependency creates vulnerability. I will not be the reason this system fails because I could not walk away. So you run. I complete what I began, by abandoning it, by ensuring it survives without me. That was always the point. He was close enough now that she could see the lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. I do not want you to leave. The words landed like stones. She felt them impact, felt something crack inside her carefully constructed defenses. She forced her voice to remain steady. What you want is also irrelevant. You're building a legacy. Legacies require sacrifice. I am one of those sacrifices. No, you're not a sacrifice. You're a choice, and I'm choosing to ask you to stay. Why? Because I have spent 15 years surrounded by people who fear me, obey me, or manipulate me. You are the only person who has ever challenged me without agenda, who has rebuilt me without asking for anything in return, who has stood beside me through every brutal decision and never flinched. I do not want to do this without you. You do not need me. The system is designed to function independently. I did not say I need you. I said I want you to stay. There is a difference. She turned away, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. If I stay, I become part of the system. I lose objectivity. I become invested. Investment creates bias. Bias creates blind spots. Blind spots create vulnerabilities. Or investment creates commitment. Commitment creates resilience. And resilience is what we need. She shook her head. Yes. You are asking me to give up the one thing that made me useful. Distance. Clarity. The ability to see this place without attachment. I am asking you to become something more than useful. To become permanent. She laughed, a sharp and bitter sound. Permanent. Nothing is permanent. You taught me that. Everything collapses eventually. People, systems, empires. All of it turns to dust. The only question is how long you can delay the collapse. Then delay it with me. She turned back to face him. Why does this matter to you? You have everything you need. The system functions. The duchy is stable. You do not need me for any of that. He stepped closer still. Because for 15 years, I have built structures and enforced order and maintained control, and I have been alone inside all of it. You are the first person who understood that loneliness without trying to exploit it. The first person who saw the machinery of power and did not worship it or fear it. You saw it as it is. Brutal. Necessary. And ultimately hollow unless it serves something beyond itself. You made me believe it could serve something beyond itself. And now you want to walk away from that as if it means nothing. It does not mean nothing. It means I succeeded, and success requires departure. Yes. Why? Because staying would mean admitting that I need this, that I need you, and I cannot afford to need anything. The confession escaped before she could stop it. She froze, realizing what she had revealed. Alaric stared at her, something unreadable crossing his face. You think need is weakness. I know it is. You are wrong. Her voice was barely a whisper. I have been alone my entire life. I have survived by never needing anything I could not provide for myself. Need creates dependency. Dependency creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates destruction. I watched my family destroy themselves through dependency on systems that betrayed them. I will not repeat that mistake. So you run before attachment becomes need. Yes. And you believe that is strength. I believe it is survival. He reached out slowly and took her hand. She did not pull away. His grip was firm, grounding. When he spoke, his voice was rough. Survival is staying alive. Living is more than that. I have spent 15 years surviving, building, controlling, and I have been empty through all of it. You filled that emptiness without trying, without asking for anything. You walked into my fortress and refused to kneel, and in refusing, you gave me something I did not know I was missing. Partnership. Equals standing beside each other rather than one kneeling before the other. I do not need you to function. I want you to stay because staying means we built something together, and together is better than alone. She felt tears prickling at the edges of her vision. She had not cried in years, had not allowed herself the weakness. But something in his words, in the raw honesty of them, broke through defenses she had maintained so long she had forgotten they were defenses. If I stay, everything changes. Yes. If I stay, I lose the ability to leave. Yes. If I stay, I become vulnerable. Yes. She pulled her hand free and turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to stay, how to be part of something without losing myself inside it. Then we learn together, because I do not know how to let go of control without losing everything. But I'm trying, and I'm asking you to try with me. She stood silent for a long moment. Outside, the citadel moved through its night rhythms, guards on walls, fires burning low, the endless machinery of governance continuing whether they willed it or not. Finally, she spoke. If I stay, we set conditions, boundaries. I am not your subordinate, not your consort, not your possession. I am your partner. Equals. Always. Agreed. I retain independence, my own chambers, my own work. I am not absorbed into your identity. Agreed. And if this fails, if we destroy what we built because we could not maintain professional distance, we acknowledge failure and I leave without resistance. Agreed. She turned back to face him. Then I stay. Not because I need you, but because I choose you. There is a difference. He smiled, genuine and unguarded. Yes, there is. They stood facing each other in the dim light of her chamber, two people who had rebuilt an empire together and were now attempting something far more difficult. Building something personal inside structures designed to eliminate the personal entirely. It was dangerous, unprecedented, potentially catastrophic. They did not care. The following morning, Alaric convened the council and made an announcement. Lady Seraphine Lorne would remain permanently as chief advisor to the ducal throne, with authority equal to the regent council and answerable only to the duke himself. Her position would be codified in the succession documents. Her voice would carry weight equivalent to any regent. The council absorbed this in stunned silence. Then Lady Mary's began clapping. Slowly, others joined. Within moments, the entire council was applauding. Not because they loved Seraphine. Most of them feared her, but because her presence meant stability, continuity, the assurance that the transition would not collapse into chaos. Seraphine stood beside Alaric, expressionless. When the applause faded, she spoke. I accept this position with full awareness of its responsibilities. I will serve this duchy with the same rigor I have always applied. I will challenge decisions I believe are flawed. I will identify threats before they metastasize. And I will ensure that the systems we have built endure beyond any individual. That is my commitment. The council dispersed. Alaric and Seraphine remained in the chamber. That was a political risk, she said. Elevating me formally creates a target. Everything worth doing is a risk. And if your enemies use me to attack you, then we eliminate them, as we always have. She smiled faintly. You have learned well, or you have corrupted me thoroughly. Likely both. They left the chamber together and walked through corridors that suddenly felt different. Not because the stones had changed, but because the people moving through them had. They were no longer duke and advisor. They were partners, architects, equals. That transformation was more revolutionary than any reform they had implemented. Because in a world built on hierarchy and dominance, equality was the most dangerous idea of all. Duchess. 3 weeks later, everything shattered. A message arrived from the southern provinces. Not a routine report. An emergency courier, half dead from riding through hostile territory, carrying a sealed document marked with blood. Alaric opened it in the throne room. Seraphine stood beside him. He read it once, then again, then handed it to her without speaking. She read it. Her expression did not change, but her hands tightened on the parchment. The message was simple, brutal, final. The noble houses had united. Not just the duchy's houses, houses from neighboring territories. Rival lords who had been enemies for generations had found common cause. Their grievance was singular. Duke Alaric Varrington had destabilized the entire regional power structure through his reforms. By distributing authority and formalizing succession, he had demonstrated that absolute power was not necessary. That precedent threatened every authoritarian system in the surrounding territories. They had decided he could not be allowed to succeed. An army was forming, multiple armies actually, converging on Blackstone Citadel from 3 directions. Estimated strength exceeded 15,000 soldiers. The siege would begin within 10 days. The message ended with a demand: abdicate, dissolve the reforms, restore absolute ducal authority, and pledge to never again implement distributed governance. In exchange, Alaric would be allowed to live in exile. Refuse, and Blackstone Citadel would be razed. Everyone inside would be executed, no exceptions. Seraphine set the message down carefully. Her voice was steady. This is extinction-level threat. Yes, they are not bluffing. No, we cannot defend against 15,000 soldiers. Our garrison numbers 4,000. We would be overwhelmed within days. Correct. So we have 3 options. Surrender and accept exile. Fight and die. Or flee and abandon everything we built. Alaric stood and walked to the window. Below, the citadel moved through its routines, unaware that destruction was marching toward it, unaware that 10 days remained before everything ended. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. There is a fourth option. She waited. We do not defend the citadel. We defend the idea. The reforms are documented. The structures are established. The system exists independent of this place. If Blackstone falls, the duchy continues through regional councils. They cannot destroy what we built by destroying where we built it. You are proposing we evacuate. I am proposing we survive. Scatter the council members. Distribute the documents. Embed the knowledge throughout the duchy so thoroughly that no siege can erase it. Let them take the citadel. Let them believe they have won. And then we rebuild from the outside. And you, where do you go? Wherever you go. She turned to face him fully. They will hunt you. Every noble lord in the region will want your head. You cannot hide. You cannot run far enough. Then I do not run. I become what they fear most. Not a duke ruling from a throne, but an idea moving through shadows. They can take my fortress. They cannot take what I built. And as long as that exists, they have already lost. She stared at him. You are proposing to abandon 15 years of absolute authority to become a fugitive defending a system from exile. Yes, that is insane. That is evolution. She felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, not panic, something closer to awe. He had spent his entire life building control, and now he was willing to release it entirely to preserve the idea that control was not necessary. That was not pragmatism. That was faith. Belief that structures could outlast individuals, that systems could endure beyond their architects. It was everything she had been trying to teach him, and he had finally learned. She stepped closer. If we do this, there is no going back. We become what we swore we would never be. Powerless. Dependent on systems we built but no longer command directly. Yes. And if those systems fail, then we die having tried something better than what came before. That is legacy. She reached out and took his hand. Then we do it. We evacuate. We scatter. We survive. And we watch the system endure without us. Together. Always. They stood together in the throne room, holding hands, staring out over a citadel that would soon fall but had already succeeded in ways its enemies could not comprehend. In 10 days, Blackstone's citadel would burn. Duke Alaric Varrington would cease to exist as a political entity. The reforms would be tested in the most brutal way possible, and everything they had built would either endure or collapse into the ashes of good intentions destroyed by reality. They had no certainty, no guarantees, no control, but they had each other. And they had belief that systems could survive individuals if those individuals were willing to sacrifice everything to give those systems a chance. That was the final transformation, not from dictator to democrat, from controller to believer. From man who demanded obedience to man who trusted structures enough to die for them. It was the hardest thing Alaric had ever done, and the only thing that mattered. The siege was coming, the citadel would fall, but the idea would survive, and that had to be enough. And that had to be enough. But knowing something has to be enough and believing it when 15,000 soldiers are marching toward everything you built are two different things entirely. Alaric stood at the window watching dawn break over Blackstone Citadel, and felt the weight of what was coming press against his chest like a physical force. 10 days. That was all they had. 10 days to evacuate everything that mattered, scatter the pieces of a system across a duchy that might not survive long enough to reassemble them, and transform from rulers into ghosts. This was what evolution looked like when stripped of theory and forced into practice. Brutal, immediate, irreversible. Seraphine entered without knocking. She never knocked anymore. That formality had died somewhere between partnership and whatever they had become. She carried a stack of documents and set them on his desk. Evacuation protocols. I have identified 12 safe locations across the duchy. Regional councils will be notified through encrypted channels. Key documents are being copied and distributed. By the time the siege begins, the system will be embedded in enough places that destroying the citadel will accomplish nothing. Alaric turned from the window. And the people? How many can we evacuate? Approximately 3,000. Servants, administrative staff, non-essential personnel. They leave tonight in groups small enough to avoid detection. The garrison remains until the final day to maintain the illusion of normal operations. And us. We leave last, after everyone else is clear. That gives us less than 12 hours before the armies arrive. Correct. He walked to the desk and studied the evacuation map she had drawn. Routes marked in red. Safe houses marked in blue. 12 points scattered across the duchy like seeds thrown into soil that might be too poisoned to let them grow. It was comprehensive, meticulous, and utterly dependent on coordination across a system that had never been tested under this kind of pressure. This could fail at any point, he said quietly. One betrayal, one intercepted message, one regional council that decides survival means cooperating with the invasion rather than protecting us. Any of those failures collapses the entire plan. Yes. And you believe it will work. I believe it is the only option that does not guarantee failure. Surrender guarantees your death and the destruction of everything we built. Fighting guarantees the same outcome with more casualties. Fleeing without preparation guarantees we have nothing to return to. This way, we have a chance. Small, fragile, but real. He looked up at her. You understand that if this fails, we die. Not quickly, not mercifully. They will make examples of us. Public executions designed to demonstrate that reform is treason and treason ends in blood. I understand, and you are still willing to proceed. I am still willing to fight for something beyond survival. That is what separates us from them. They want control. We want creation. Control dies when the controller dies. Creation endures, even if we do not. He reached across the desk and took her hand. When did you become the optimist? I am not an optimist. I am a realist who has chosen to believe that reality can be changed through will and structure. There is a difference. He smiled despite everything. You sound like me. Then we have both learned. The evacuation began that night. 3,000 people moved through Blackstone Citadel in organized chaos. Servants carrying bundles of belongings. Administrative staff destroying records that could be used against regional councils. Families leaving behind homes they had occupied for generations. All of it conducted in near silence because noise attracted attention, and attention was fatal. Alaric moved through the citadel, supervising the exodus. He stopped to speak with an elderly cook who had served his family for 40 years. The woman was crying quietly, clutching a small bag that contained everything she could carry. Your Grace, I do not understand. Why must we leave? This is our home. Alaric crouched down to her level. Because staying means dying. The armies coming here do not distinguish between soldiers and servants. Everyone inside these walls will be killed to make a point. I am giving you a chance to survive. Take it. But where will we go? To places we have prepared. You will be cared for. I give you my word. And you, Your Grace, where will you go? Wherever I am needed. The cook reached out and touched his face with a trembling hand. You are a good man. History will remember that. He stood without responding. History was written by victors, and he had no illusions about which side would control the narrative if the armies succeeded. He would not be remembered as a good man. He would be remembered as a cautionary tale, the duke who tried to distribute power and destroyed himself in the process. That legacy was acceptable if the system survived. If it did not, he would simply be erased. By dawn, 2,000 people had evacuated. Another 1,000 remained, moving through preparation for the next phase. Seraphine coordinated from the council chamber, cross-referencing departure logs with arrival confirmations from safe houses. Every successful evacuation was marked in green. Every delay was marked in yellow. Failures would be marked in red, but so far there were none. Lady Maris entered, carrying another stack of reports. Regional councils are responding. 11 of 12 have confirmed receipt of the documents and agreed to maintain governance structures independently. The 12th has not responded. Which one? Merivale, the same region where the crop failure occurred. Yes. Seraphine set down her pen. Send a secondary courier. If Merivale does not respond within 24 hours, we assume they have been compromised. Redistribute their governance documents to neighboring councils and remove them from the network. And if they are not compromised, if they are simply delayed, then they will rejoin the network when communication is restored. But we cannot afford to wait for confirmation that might never come. We proceed as if every delay is a threat until proven otherwise. Maris nodded and left. Seraphine returned to her coordination, but something cold had settled in her chest. Merivale, the first region to implement distributed authority. the first success story of the reforms. If they had been turned, it meant the invasion was not just military, it was ideological. The noble houses were not simply trying to kill Alaric. They were trying to prove that reform was impossible, that the only stable governance was absolute authority enforced through fear. That made this fight existential in ways she had not fully grasped until now. They were not defending a duchy. They were defending the possibility that power could evolve. If they lost, it would be generations before anyone attempted this again. The failure would be used as evidence that hierarchy was natural and distribution was chaos. She would not allow that. By the third day, the citadel was half empty. Corridors that had been filled with servants and officials now echoed with emptiness. The remaining garrison maintained perimeter security, but everyone could feel the shift. This place was dying, not in battle, in exodus. The heart was being removed piece by piece until only the skeleton remained. Alaric stood in the throne room looking at the chair he had occupied for 15 years. Heavy oak, carved with symbols of authority that stretched back centuries. He had never liked it. It was uncomfortable by design, meant to remind the occupant that rule was burden rather than privilege. Now it was just furniture, a relic of a system that might not exist in 10 days. He heard footsteps behind him. Seraphine, the last evacuation group leaves tomorrow at dawn. After that, only essential personnel remain. Approximately 400, mostly garrison soldiers who volunteered to maintain the illusion until the final day. Volunteered or were ordered. Volunteered. I gave them the option to leave. They chose to stay. Why? Because they believe in what we are doing, or they are loyal to you, or they want to die in a way that matters. Does the reason matter if the outcome is the same? He turned to face her. 400 soldiers against 15,000. They will be slaughtered. Yes. And you are comfortable with that? No. But I am comfortable with giving them the choice. They are not children. They understand the stakes. If they choose to stand, we honor that choice by making their stand meaningful. Meaningful. He laughed bitterly. We are asking them to die so we can run. That is not meaning. That is sacrifice without purpose. The purpose is time. Every hour they hold this citadel is another hour for the system to solidify, another hour for regional councils to establish authority, another hour for the duchy to realize it does not need Blackstone Citadel to function. That is not sacrifice without purpose. That is purpose defined by sacrifice. He looked back at the throne. And us. We run while they die. We survive so the system has leadership when it needs coordination. That is not cowardice. That is strategy. It feels like cowardice. Then feel it. And do it anyway. Because the alternative is standing here making a symbolic gesture while everything we built collapses. You can die heroically or you can live pragmatically. The choice is yours. He met her eyes. When did you become so ruthless? The day I walked into the citadel and decided survival required clarity. You taught me that. Now I am teaching it back to you. He reached out and pulled her close. She did not resist. They stood together in the empty throne room. Two people who had remade an empire and were now watching it transform into something they could no longer control. That was the cost of creation. You built something, and if you built it right, it stopped needing you. The trick was accepting obsolescence as success rather than failure. I'm afraid, he said quietly. Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. Fear means you care. Fear means you are human. Use it. Do not let it paralyze you. And if I cannot, then I will carry us both until you can walk again. That is what partnership means. He held her tighter. I do not deserve you. Probably not. But you have me anyway. They stood together until the light faded and the throne room filled with shadows. Somewhere outside, soldiers were preparing for a battle they could not win. Somewhere across the duchy, evacuated people were arriving at safe houses and trying to build lives from fragments. Somewhere in the distance, 15,000 soldiers were marching closer with every passing hour. 10 days had become 7, then 5, then 3. On the 8th day, the armies were sighted, 3 columns converging from different directions. Banners from noble houses that had been enemies for generations now flying side by side. Alaric stood on the battlements watching them approach, a slow, inevitable tide of steel and hatred moving toward everything he had built. Sir Rowan stood beside him. The old commander had volunteered to stay despite being relieved of his council position. When Alaric asked why, Rowan had said simply, "Because you were right and I was wrong. That is worth dying for." Now Rowan studied the approaching armies through a brass scope. 15,000 is accurate, possibly more. They have siege equipment, catapults, battering rams. They are not planning a quick strike. They are planning total destruction. How long can we hold? 2 days. 3, if we are lucky. Once they breach the outer walls, it becomes close quarters. We can make them pay for every corridor, but the outcome is inevitable. Alaric lowered the scope. Then we hold for 3 days. Give the system every hour we can, and then we leave through the eastern passage and pray the escape route has not been discovered. Rowan turned to him. Your Grace, I have served you for 20 years. I have disagreed with you often, but I have never doubted your commitment to this duchy. What you are attempting is either brilliant or insane, possibly both. If it works, you will have changed everything. If it fails, you will be erased. Either way, it has been an honor. Alaric clasped his shoulder. The honor is mine, Rowan. Hold them. Make them remember that Blackstone Citadel did not fall easily. I will hold them until the stones themselves burn. He left. Alaric remained on the battlements, watching the armies draw closer. He could see individual banners now. House Cardine, House Vrel, House Thorn, all of them united by fear of what he represented, change, evolution, the possibility that their own authority was not eternal. They were right to fear him, because even if they killed him, the idea would survive. And ideas were harder to kill than men. Seraphine joined him as the sun set. The evacuation is complete. Everyone who is leaving has left. Only the garrison remains. 412 soldiers, all volunteers. And the regional councils. 11 confirmed operational, Merivale still silent. We proceed without them. Then we are ready as we will ever be. He took her hand. Are you afraid? Terrified. Good. That makes 2 of us. They watched the armies make camp in the distance. Hundreds of fires appeared as night fell, surrounding the citadel in a ring of light. Tomorrow, the siege would begin. Tomorrow, everything they had built would face its final test. Alaric turned to Seraphine. If this fails, if we die, I want you to know that rebuilding this duchy with you was the best thing I have ever done. Not ruling, not enforcing order, not building systems. Standing beside you and creating something that might endure. That was the point of everything. If we die, I will not hear your eulogy. So say what matters now. I love you. The words fell between them like stones. Simple, direct, true. Seraphine felt something break inside her chest. Not pain. Release. The final wall coming down. She had spent her entire life avoiding those words because they meant vulnerability. And vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness meant death. But standing here on the eve of destruction, she realized that avoiding vulnerability was just another kind of death. Slower, colder, more complete. I love you too. He pulled her close and kissed her. Not gentle, not tentative, desperate and fierce, and full of everything they had not said in the months of rebuilding an empire together. When they broke apart, both were breathless. That changes nothing about tomorrow, she said. I know. We still run. We still leave them to die. We still gamble everything on a system that might collapse. I know. And if it fails, we die having accomplished nothing except proving that reform is impossible. Then we die together. That is more than most people get. She looked out over the ring of fires. 15,000 soldiers, all of them convinced that destroying Blackstone Citadel would restore order to a world they understood. They were wrong. The world had already changed. The Citadel was just stone. The real transformation had occurred in the documents now scattered across the duchy, in the regional councils now operating independently, in the structure now embedded so deeply that no siege could erase it. But explaining that to people who believed power came from the throne rather than the system was impossible. So they would fight and die and believe they had won when the Citadel fell. Let them believe it. The truth would reveal itself later. The siege began at dawn. Catapults launched stones at the outer walls. Battering rams moved forward under cover of shields. Archers exchanged volleys with defenders on the battlements. The sound was deafening, stone cracking, metal ringing, men screaming, the ancient machinery of war grinding everything into blood and rubble. Alaric moved through the citadel coordinating defense. He had removed his formal robes and wore simple armor, a sword at his hip, a shield on his back. He was not a figurehead anymore. He was a soldier, one more body in the desperate effort to buy time. Sir Rowan commanded from the walls. His voice carried over the chaos, issuing orders with the calm precision of a man who had accepted death and was now simply managing the details. Archers to the east tower. Reinforce the gate. Boiling oil on the ram crews. Every command calculated to maximize casualties among the attackers and delay the inevitable breach. By midday, the outer wall showed cracks. By evening, a section collapsed. Soldiers poured through the gap. The garrison fell back to the inner courtyard, creating a killing ground where superior numbers became disadvantage in close quarters. The attackers paid for every foot with bodies stacked in corridors that became abattoirs. Seraphine worked from the council chamber, monitoring reports and maintaining communication with regional councils through messengers who slipped out through hidden passages. Every hour, she sent confirmation that the system was holding. Every hour, the responses came back. The duchy was functioning, regional councils were maintaining order. The siege of Blackstone Citadel was distant news rather than immediate crisis. The system was working, but the citadel was dying. On the second day, the inner courtyard fell. The garrison retreated into the citadel itself, holding staircases and corridors in desperate close quarters fighting. Sir Rowan took an arrow through the shoulder but refused to fall back. He stood at the top of the main staircase, sword in hand, personally killing anyone who tried to pass. Alaric fought beside him. His armor was dented. His sword was notched from striking armor and bone. His body screamed with exhaustion, but he did not stop. Could not stop, because every minute they held was another minute for the system to solidify. Rowan glanced at him between attacks. "Your Grace, you need to go. The eastern passage is still clear. If you wait much longer, they will discover it." "Not yet." "Your Grace?" "Not yet." Another wave came up the stairs. Alaric and Rowan met them with brutal efficiency. The staircase became slippery with blood. Bodies tumbled back down, tripping those behind them. The attackers were fighting uphill against men who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. But numbers always won eventually. By evening of the second day, the garrison was down to 200. They held the upper levels of the citadel, but the lower floors were overrun. Smoke rose from fires, started deliberately to drive defenders from cover. The heat was suffocating. Seraphine found Alaric in what remained of the throne room. He was sitting on the steps below the throne, head in his hands, breathing hard. Blood soaked his armor. Not all of it his. "It is time," she said. He looked up. "Not yet." "Alaric, it is time. We have held for 2 days. The system is functioning. Staying longer accomplishes nothing except ensuring we die here. I cannot leave them. You can, and you will. Because they did not volunteer to die, so you could join them. They volunteered to buy you time. Honor that by using it." He stood slowly. Every muscle protested. He was 43 years old and had just fought for 2 straight days. His body was failing. But his mind remained clear. Seraphine was right. She was always right. Staying was gesture. Leaving was strategy. He walked to the throne and placed one hand on the armrest. 15 years in this chair. 15 years of absolute control. 15 years of believing that power came from the man rather than the system. He had been wrong. He turned and walked away without looking back. Inquet. The eastern passage was a tunnel carved through the cliffs below the citadel. Ancient, secret, known only to a handful of people. Alaric and Seraphine moved through it with 30 remaining soldiers, the last of the garrison willing to abandon the citadel. Behind them, the sounds of battle continued. Screams, crashes, the citadel consuming itself. They emerged 3 miles from Blackstone on a rocky beach battered by waves. Boats waited, small and nondescript, crewed by fishermen who asked no questions. Alaric looked back at the citadel rising against the night sky. Fires burned in dozens of windows. Smoke rose in thick columns. From this distance, it looked like the fortress was bleeding light. Sir Rowan had not come. He had chosen to stay, to hold the throne room until the end, to make them kill him in the seat of power, so they understood that taking the citadel meant nothing if the will behind it survived. He was a good man. He deserved better than this. Alaric climbed into the boat. Seraphine followed. The fishermen pushed off and the boat slipped into the darkness, moving south along the coast toward the first safe house. Behind them, Blackstone Citadel burned. The armies would occupy it by morning. They would celebrate their victory. They would believe they had crushed the threat. Some. They had no idea that the threat was no longer contained in stone walls. It was embedded in documents scattered across the duchy, in regional councils operating independently, in a system designed to function without its architect. The citadel could burn, the duke could fall, the duchy would endure. That was the plan. That was the belief. That was the gamble they had made with lives and blood and everything they had built. Now they would discover if belief was enough to overcome reality. They traveled for 3 days, moving between safe houses, constantly shifting locations to avoid detection. Each stop brought news from the regional councils, some good, some devastating. 8 councils reported stable operations. Governance continued without interruption. The population accepted distributed authority because it had been implemented gradually over months. 3 councils reported unrest. Local nobles were challenging the new structure, demanding return to centralized authority. Conflicts were escalating. 1 council had collapsed entirely. Merivale. The region had been seized by noble forces aligned with the invasion. The council members had been arrested, some executed, others in hiding. Seraphine compiled the reports with mechanical precision. She showed no emotion, no reaction, just relentless documentation of what was working and what was failing. That detachment was how she survived. Lock everything away. Process later. Function now. Alaric watched her work and recognized the strategy because he had used it himself for years. Compartmentalize. Separate the man from the duke, the person from the position, the emotions from the decisions. It was effective. It was also corrosive. Eventually, the compartments broke down, and everything you had locked away came flooding back. He wondered when that flood would hit. For him, for her, for both of them. On the 6th day after the fall of Blackstone, they received word that the noble armies were dispersing. The siege was over. The citadel was occupied but not destroyed. The nobles had decided to use it as a symbol, a warning to anyone who considered following Alaric's example. They installed a new duke, Lord Victor Cardine, a puppet who answered to a council of noble houses rather than governing independently. The reforms were officially dissolved. Centralized authority was restored. Distributed governance was declared illegal. Anyone caught implementing regional autonomy would be executed for treason. The message was clear. The old order had won. Reform was crushed. Alaric's experiment had failed, except it had not. Because in 8 regions, governance continued exactly as designed. The population barely noticed the change at the top because their daily lives were managed by regional councils that operated independently. Taxes were collected. Disputes were resolved. Infrastructure was maintained. The system functioned. In 3 regions, conflicts continued. But even there, the councils had not collapsed. They were fighting, adapting, surviving. Only Merivale had truly fallen. 1 failure out of 12. That was not catastrophic. That was inevitable. No system succeeded everywhere immediately. The question was whether the successes could be sustained long enough to become normalized. Alaric sat in a small room in a farmhouse 3 days south of Blackstone, reading reports by candlelight. Seraphine sat across from him, compiling data from messenger networks. "It is working," she said quietly. He looked up. 8 successes, 3 conflicts, 1 failure. That is not working. That is chaos. No, chaos is collapse. This is adaptation. The system is under pressure and most of it is holding. That is success. Success. He set down the report. "We lost the citadel. I am a fugitive. You are a traitor. 400 soldiers died buying us time, and you call this success. I call this survival. The citadel was always going to fall. You were always going to be hunted. People were always going to die. Those were known costs. The question was whether the system would outlast the siege. It has. That is success." He stood and walked to the small window. Outside, darkness pressed against glass. No lights, no fires, just emptiness. They were hiding in the middle of nowhere while enemies controlled the center of power. This was not how it was supposed to end. except it had not ended. That was what Seraphine was trying to make him understand. The story was not over. The citadel had fallen, but the duchy survived. He had been removed from power, but the system continued. Control had been taken, but creation endured. That was evolution, brutal, incomplete, ongoing. He turned back to her. What now? Now we coordinate. We support the councils that are functioning. We stabilize the regions in conflict. We rebuild Merivale from outside. And we wait. Wait for what? For the puppet duke to fail. For the noble council to fracture. For the population to realize that centralized authority serves the powerful, while distributed authority serves everyone. We wait for the system to prove itself superior through function rather than theory. And how long will that take? Months, years, possibly decades, but it will happen. Because we built something that works, and things that work eventually replace things that do not. He sat back down. You have more faith than I do. I have more patience. Faith is belief without evidence. Patience is waiting for evidence to accumulate. I am patient. They sat in silence. Outside, the night pressed close. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Normal sounds. Normal life. The world continuing despite empires rising and falling. Alaric reached across the table and took her hand. I could not have done this without you. You would have tried. You would have failed. But you would have tried. He smiled. Always honest. Always. I love you for that. I know. They sat together holding hands in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, while the duchy they had rebuilt tried to survive without them. It was not the ending either had imagined, but it was the ending they had earned. And somewhere in 8 regions, councils met. Decisions were made. Governance continued. The system functioned. The Duke was dead. Long live the duchy. 10 days after the fall of Blackstone, a messenger arrived at the farmhouse. He was young, barely 18, covered in road dust and exhausted. He carried a sealed letter marked with the symbol of the Eastern Regional Council. Seraphine opened it, read it twice, then handed it to Alaric without speaking. The letter was simple, direct, revolutionary. The 8 functioning regional councils had convened in secret. They had discussed the current situation. The puppet duke in Blackstone Citadel. The noble council attempting to restore centralized authority. The threat of military action against regions maintaining distributed governance. They had made a decision. They formally rejected the authority of Duke Victor Cardine. They declared the noble council illegitimate. They announced the formation of the Commonwealth of Barrington, a federation of independent regions bound by common law and mutual cooperation rather than centralized control. And they requested that Duke Alaric Barrington return as Chancellor of the Commonwealth, not as absolute ruler, as coordinator and arbiter, first among equals. The system had evolved beyond him, and now it was inviting him back, not to control it, to serve it. Alaric set the letter down carefully. His hands were shaking. They want me back, not as Duke, as Chancellor. There is a difference. I understand the difference. I am not certain I can accept it. Why not? Because for 15 years I was absolute authority. I made decisions and they were executed without question. Now they are asking me to advise, to coordinate, to serve rather than command. That is a complete inversion of everything I was. Yes, that is the point. You spent 15 years as the system. Now you get to be part of the system. That is evolution. And if I cannot adapt, if I try to reclaim absolute authority, then they remove you and continue without you. The system no longer depends on any individual. That includes you. That was always the goal. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, dawn was breaking. Light spilled across fields that stretched to the horizon. Ordinary land, ordinary people, living lives that had nothing to do with empires or reform or the constant brutal calculation of power. He had built something that served them, not him, them. That was the entire point. And now they were asking him to return and serve that same system, to become less than he was, so the system could become more than he had designed. That was the final transformation. From controller to servant, from dictator to democrat, from man who demanded obedience to man who offered service. It was the hardest thing he had ever considered, and the only thing that mattered. He turned back to Seraphine. If I do this, I am no longer Duke Alaric Barrington, absolute ruler of a centralized duchy. I become Chancellor Alaric Varrington, coordinator of a federated commonwealth. I lose everything I was. You lose nothing that matters. You transform what you were into what you need to be. That is not loss. That is growth. And you, what do you become? Whatever the Commonwealth needs, advisor, coordinator, partner. The specifics are irrelevant. The work is what matters. He walked to her and pulled her close. Are you ready for this? I have been ready since the day I walked into Blackstone Citadel. The question is whether you are ready. He held her and felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear, not doubt. Certainty. Cold and clear and absolute. He had spent 15 years building control. Now he would spend however long remained building something better. Something that endured. Something that served. That was legacy. Not the throne, not the citadel, not the absolute authority, the system, the structure, the commonwealth. That was immortality. He released her and picked up the letter. Send word to the councils. Tell them I accept. Not as duke, as chancellor, first among equals, servant of the commonwealth. She smiled. They will be relieved. And the puppet duke in Blackstone, Victor Cardine and his noble council, they will declare war on the commonwealth. They have to. Allowing distributed authority to succeed threatens everything they believe. Then we prepare for war. Yes. He looked at her. This is not over. No. This is just beginning. They stood together in the growing light. Two people who had remade an empire and were now preparing to defend it from those who believed empires could only be built on hierarchy and fear. The Commonwealth would face armies, betrayals, failures. Some regions would fall. Some would fracture. Some would thrive. But the system would endure. Because it was no longer dependent on any individual. It was embedded in structure, in documents, in councils operating independently, in people who had tasted distributed authority and would not easily surrender it. Duke Victor Cardine and his noble council believed they had won. They had taken the citadel. They had driven Alaric into exile. They had restored centralized authority. They were wrong. The real war was just beginning. Not a war of armies and sieges, but a war of ideas. Centralized control versus distributed governance. Hierarchy versus federation. The old order versus the new. And in that war, Alaric and Seraphine had already won the first battle, because the system was functioning. 8 regions operating independently, proving that distributed authority was not chaos but coordination, demonstrating that power did not require concentration to be effective. The Noble Council would attack. They would siege Commonwealth regions. They would try to crush the Federation before it could solidify. Let them try. Because every attack would demonstrate that the old order required violence to maintain itself. Every siege would show that centralized authority survived through coercion rather than consent. Every victory they claimed would be temporary because you could not kill an idea by burning buildings or executing leaders. The Commonwealth was an idea. And ideas spread. Alaric walked to the door of the farmhouse and looked out over fields bathed in morning light. Somewhere beyond those fields, 8 regions were meeting, governing, functioning, proving that everything he had believed for 15 years was wrong and everything he had built in the last year was right. He had been Duke Alaric Varrington, absolute ruler of a centralized duchy maintained through fear and control. Now he would become Chancellor Alaric Varrington, coordinator of a federated commonwealth maintained through structure and consent. That transformation was not loss. It was transcendence. The citadel had fallen. The duke was dead. But the commonwealth was rising, and the war to defend it was about to begin. But war is never what you imagine when you stand at its threshold looking forward. From a distance, it appears clean, strategic. A contest of wills and resources resolved through calculated violence. The reality is messier. War is not armies colliding on open fields. It is villages burned because they chose the wrong side. Children starving because supply lines were severed. Families torn apart because loyalty became a weapon wielded by both sides without mercy. Alaric had known this intellectually. Now he would learn it in ways that would carve new scars across everything he believed about power and the cost of defending what you build. The Commonwealth declared itself formally 6 weeks after the fall of Blackstone's citadel. 8 regional councils signed the founding charter in a ceremony held in secret in the town of Heron's Cross, far enough from the puppet duke's reach to avoid immediate retaliation. Alaric attended not as duke but as witness. He stood at the back of the hall while regional representatives signed documents that transformed isolated councils into a federation. It was bureaucratic, unglamorous, revolutionary. Duke Victor Cardine responded exactly as predicted. He declared the Commonwealth illegal, its leaders traitors, and its existence an act of war against the legitimate authority of Barrington. He mobilized what remained of the noble armies and marched toward Heron's Cross with 8,000 soldiers. The message was clear: submit or burn. Or the Commonwealth did not submit. Instead, it did something Victor had not anticipated. It recruited, not professional soldiers, ordinary people, farmers who understood that distributed governance meant lower taxes and fair dispute resolution. Merchants who realized that regional autonomy meant less corruption and more predictable trade. Workers who recognized that power shared was power that served them rather than exploited them. Within 3 weeks, the Commonwealth had assembled a militia numbering 12,000, untrained, poorly equipped, but motivated by something Victor's soldiers were not: belief. The first battle occurred at a river crossing 20 miles north of Heron's Cross. Victor's forces arrived expecting to sweep through poorly organized resistance. Instead, they found defensive positions prepared with surprising sophistication: trenches, barricades, coordinated archer formations. The Commonwealth militia had been trained by former garrison soldiers who understood warfare and had taught basics to people who had never held weapons before. The battle lasted 6 hours. Victor's forces suffered heavy casualties trying to cross the river under constant fire. They eventually broke through, but at such cost that pursuing further became impossible. They retreated to regroup. The Commonwealth claimed victory not because they had destroyed the enemy, but because they had proven they could fight. Alaric received the battle report in a farmhouse converted into temporary headquarters. Seraphine stood beside him reading the casualty estimates. 300 Commonwealth militia dead, 700 wounded. Victor's forces had lost twice that number, but they were professional soldiers who could be replaced. The militia were farmers and merchants who had families and responsibilities beyond war. "This is unsustainable," Alaric said quietly. "We cannot win through attrition. Every soldier Victor loses can be replaced. Every militiaman we lose is a person with a life that matters beyond this conflict. Then we do not win through attrition. We win through exhaustion. Victor's armies are expensive. The noble houses funding him expect quick victory and return to normal trade. The longer this drags on, the more it costs them. We make this war so expensive that continuing it becomes more damaging than accepting the Commonwealth's existence." Seraphine looked up from the report. Scorched earth. Strategic denial. "We do not engage in open battle unless terrain favors us. We harass supply lines. We make every mile they advance cost resources and morale. We turn this into a war of patience rather than decisive engagement. Victor wants a quick resolution. We deny him that." Alaric walked to the window. Outside, injured militia members were being treated in makeshift medical tents. Men with arrows still lodged in shoulders. Women with burns from flaming pitch. All of them volunteers who had believed his promise that distributed governance was worth defending. Now they were paying for that belief with blood and pain. How many more will die before Victor exhausts himself? Unknown. Hundreds. Possibly thousands. But if we surrender, the Commonwealth collapses and centralized authority is restored permanently. Everything we built is erased. Every person who died defending it died for nothing. The question is not how many will die. The question is whether their deaths purchase something that endures. He turned back to her. "When did we become people who calculate acceptable casualties? The moment we chose to build something worth dying for. You cannot create without accepting that creation requires sacrifice. The only choice is whether that sacrifice serves a purpose or wastes lives defending illusions. This is not illusion. This is structure. That makes the sacrifice meaningful." Meaningful. He repeated the word as if testing its weight. "Tell that to the families burying their dead." "I will. And I will tell them that their loved ones died defending a system where their children will have voices in governance rather than being subjects to absolute authority. That is meaning. That is legacy. That is worth dying for." He studied her. "You have become harder than I ever was." "No. I have become honest about what we are doing. You built control through fear. I am building resilience through belief. Both require sacrifice." The difference is that your sacrifices maintained a system that served you. Mine maintain a system that serves everyone. That distinction matters. She left to coordinate defensive positions. Alaric remained at the window watching injured people receive treatment they might not survive. He wondered if Seraphine was right, if sacrifice in service of distributed governance was fundamentally different from sacrifice in service of centralized control, or if all sacrifice was the same and he was simply rationalizing violence to avoid facing what he had become, a man who calculated acceptable casualties, a man who measured lives against outcomes, a man who had transformed from dictator to democrat without losing the ruthlessness that made dictatorship effective. That transformation was supposed to make him better. Instead, it had made him more dangerous, because now his ruthlessness served an idea that people believed in, which meant they volunteered for sacrifice rather than being coerced. That made the body count higher and the moral calculus more complicated. He had wanted to evolve beyond violence. Instead, he had simply found new ways to justify it. The war dragged on for 8 months, not in grand battles but in constant skirmishing, supply raids, ambushes, strategic retreats. The Commonwealth militia learned to fight not as soldiers but as insurgents. They knew the terrain, they had local support. They could disappear into populations that protected them because those populations benefited from the system they were defending. Victor's armies became increasingly frustrated. They occupied towns only to face passive resistance. They established supply lines only to watch them get severed overnight. They won battles, but could not translate battlefield victories into strategic control. The Commonwealth was not a traditional enemy that could be defeated through military superiority. It was an idea embedded in governance structures that continued functioning even when the people defending them were killed. That realization began fracturing the noble coalition. House Thorne withdrew its forces after losing 600 soldiers in a disastrous ambush. House Vrel negotiated secret peace with 2 Commonwealth regions, recognizing their autonomy in exchange for trade agreements. House Cardine, Victor's own house, began questioning whether the war was worth the expense. By the 10th month, Victor controlled only the territory immediately surrounding Blackstone Citadel. Everywhere else, the Commonwealth governed. Regional councils operated openly. Trade routes were established between friendly regions. Diplomatic relationships were formalized. The system had not just survived the war, it had thrived during it. Because war created pressure, and pressure forced adaptation, and adaptation revealed which structures were resilient and which were brittle. Centralized control was brittle. It required constant enforcement and collapsed when that enforcement weakened. Distributed governance was resilient. It continued functioning even when individual leaders were killed because authority was embedded in councils rather than concentrated in persons. The war proved what Alaric and Seraphine had theorized. Systems designed to function independently of any individual could survive anything except complete annihilation. And complete annihilation required resources Victor no longer possessed. In the 14th month, Victor sent a messenger requesting negotiations, not surrender. Negotiations. Recognition that the war could not be won and continuing it served no purpose beyond pride. The Commonwealth Council convened to discuss the offer. Some representatives wanted total victory, unconditional surrender. Victor tried in chains. Others wanted peace, recognition of the Commonwealth's legitimacy, and formal end to hostilities. The debate was fierce, passionate, democratic. Alaric listened without speaking. He no longer made unilateral decisions. His role as chancellor was to coordinate and advise, not command. When the debate reached deadlock, the council turned to him. "Chancellor Varrington, you have not spoken. What is your counsel?" He stood slowly. 14 months ago, I ruled this duchy through absolute authority. My word was law. My decisions were final. Dissent was not tolerated. That system was efficient, brutal, and ultimately unsustainable. It would have collapsed the moment I died because it depended entirely on me. We built something different, a system that functions through consensus rather than command. That system has survived a war that destroyed my old fortress and killed thousands of people. It survived because it does not depend on any individual. That includes me. So my counsel is this: vote, debate, reach consensus. Whatever you decide, I will support. Not because I agree with it, but because the process matters more than my opinion. That is what makes this system worth defending. He sat down. The council absorbed his words, then returned to debate. 3 hours later, they reached consensus. The Commonwealth would negotiate with Victor, not as supplicants requesting recognition, but as equals offering peace. The terms were non-negotiable. Victor would retain control of Blackstone Citadel and surrounding territories. The Commonwealth would retain autonomy over its 8 regions. Both systems would coexist. Trade between them would be established. Diplomatic channels would be opened. Future conflicts would be resolved through negotiation rather than war. It was not total victory. It was pragmatic peace, compromise that acknowledged reality rather than pursuing ideological purity. Victor accepted, not because he wanted peace, but because continuing war would bankrupt his remaining supporters. The treaty was signed in neutral territory. No ceremony, no celebration. Just 2 systems agreeing to stop killing each other because killing had become more expensive than coexisting. The war was over. The Commonwealth had survived. Alaric had transformed from duke to chancellor, from dictator to coordinator, from man who demanded obedience to man who facilitated consensus. That transformation had cost 4,000 lives, burned villages, shattered families, trauma that would echo for generations. And it had created something that might endure long enough to justify that cost. A system where power was distributed rather than concentrated, where governance served populations rather than exploited them, where authority was earned through competence rather than inherited through bloodline. Whether that system was worth 4,000 lives was a question Alaric could not answer. But he would spend whatever remained of his life ensuring those deaths purchased something more than his own redemption. 3 years after the treaty, the Commonwealth had expanded to 14 regions, not through conquest but through voluntary integration. Neighboring territories observed the system functioning and requested admission. Each request was evaluated by the Council. Each admission required consensus. The Commonwealth grew organically, spreading through example rather than coercion. Alaric and Seraphine lived in a modest house in Heron's Cross. Not a palace, not a fortress, a house. 2 stories. Small garden. Neighbors who greeted them by name rather than title. It was profoundly ordinary. That ordinariness was revolutionary for people who had spent years at the center of absolute power. One evening, they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and violet. Seraphine was reading reports from regional councils. Alaric was doing nothing, just sitting, watching light fade, thinking about the distance between what he had been and what he had become. "You are brooding," Seraphine said without looking up. "I am reflecting. Same thing." "No, brooding is dwelling on regrets. Reflecting is learning from them. There is a difference." She set down the reports. "What are you reflecting on? Whether the cost was worth the outcome. And your conclusion?" "I do not have one. 4,000 people died defending a system I designed. Their families carry that loss every day. Children grew up without parents. Partners lost the people they loved. Communities were shattered. All of it because I believed distributed governance was worth defending. Was it? I still do not know." She reached across and took his hand. "You're asking the wrong question. The question is not whether the cost was worth it. The question is whether refusing to pay that cost would have been better. If we had surrendered, the Commonwealth would not exist. Centralized authority would have been restored. Every innovation we implemented would have been erased. The people who died believed the alternative was worse than death. That belief has value even if we cannot quantify it. But I made the decision that put them in position to make that choice. I built the system they died defending. Their blood is on my hands. Yes. And you will carry that for the rest of your life. That is the cost of leadership. Not the decisions themselves, but living with the consequences of those decisions after everyone else has moved on. You wanted legacy. This is what legacy looks like. Not monuments or histories that praise your name. Scars that never fully heal and memories of people who died because they believed in what you built." He looked at her. "How do you carry it? The weight of all those deaths?" "By honoring them. By ensuring the system they died defending continues functioning. By making their sacrifice meaningful through my actions every day. I cannot bring them back. I cannot undo their deaths. But I can ensure they did not die for nothing. That is the only redemption available. And if the Commonwealth collapses, if everything we built fails, then we failed, and their deaths were wasted, and we live with that knowledge until we die. But we are not there yet. The system is functioning, growing, proving itself. That is not failure. That is success purchased at terrible cost. Both things are true simultaneously. They sat in silence as night deepened around them. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing. Market vendors were closing shops. Life continuing in all its ordinary complexity, enabled by structures that most people never thought about because those structures functioned invisibly. That was the point. Good governance was invisible. People noticed it only when it failed. The Commonwealth had not failed. It had endured war, adapted to pressure, and emerged as something resilient enough to spread beyond its origins. Whether that was worth 4,000 lives was a calculation that depended on who was making it. The families of the dead might say no. The children growing up with voices in governance might say yes. Future generations who would inherit the system might offer different answers entirely. Alaric would never know which answer was correct. He would simply carry the question until he died, and that burden was his to bear alone. 5 years after the treaty, Alaric began experiencing pains in his chest. Not sharp, not constant, just a persistent pressure that made breathing difficult. He ignored it for weeks until Seraphine noticed him wincing during a council session and forced him to see a physician. The diagnosis was predictable. His heart was failing. Decades of stress, 2 years of absolute control enforced through constant vigilance, 14 months of war, and 5 years of carrying guilt had eroded the organ that kept him alive. The physician gave him a year, maybe 2 if he rested and avoided stress. Resting was not an option. The Commonwealth still needed coordination. Regional councils still required arbitration. Diplomatic relationships still demanded maintenance. Alaric could not simply stop because his body was failing, so he continued working, managing pain through willpower and an increasing reliance on medicines that dulled sensation without addressing root causes. Seraphine knew. She said nothing because saying something would force acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would make the approaching end real in ways neither was prepared to face. So they worked together as they always had, pretending that time was not running out, that the partnership they had built would continue indefinitely. But time always ran out. That was the one constant in every human endeavor. You built something, and if you built it right, it outlasted you. The trick was accepting that your obsolescence was success rather than failure. 8 months after the diagnosis, Alaric collapsed during a council meeting. He was mid-sentence, explaining a proposed trade agreement with a neighboring territory, when his heart simply stopped cooperating. He felt pressure crushing his chest, then nothing. Then he was on the floor with people shouting and Seraphine's face above him, pale and terrified and more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. He woke 3 days later in a bed in the house they shared. Seraphine sat beside him, holding his hand, her eyes red from crying she thought he could not see. When she noticed he was awake, she straightened and composed herself with visible effort. "You collapsed. Your heart. The physician says you have weeks, maybe a month." He tried to speak. His throat was dry. She held water to his lips. He drank, then tried again. "I need to finalize the succession framework. The chancellor position cannot remain vacant. The Commonwealth needs continuity." "No. What you need is to rest. The Commonwealth will function without you. That was always the point. And if it fractures without coordination, then we adapt. As we always have. You built something resilient. Trust it. I built something that required constant maintenance. Without someone facilitating consensus, the regional councils will fracture into competing factions. Everything we built will collapse." She leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You arrogant man. You still believe the system depends on you. It does not. It never did. You were necessary for creating it. You are not necessary for maintaining it. The councils have been managing most governance independently for 3 years. Your role has been symbolic for longer than you want to admit. The Commonwealth will survive your death because it was designed to survive your death." That was the entire point. He stared at her, something breaking open inside his chest that had nothing to do with his failing heart. She was right. He had been clinging to the illusion of necessity because letting go meant accepting that he was no longer essential, that the system had evolved beyond him, that his obsolescence was the measure of his success. That acceptance was harder than anything he had done, harder than distributing power, harder than evacuating the citadel, harder than fighting a war. Because it meant acknowledging that everything he had been, all the control and authority and command, had been successfully transformed into structures that no longer needed him. He was unnecessary. And that was exactly what he had wanted to achieve. The fact that achieving it felt like loss rather than victory revealed how deeply his identity had been tied to being necessary. "I do not know how to stop," he said quietly. Then learn, because you are dying. And you can spend your remaining time trying to control what happens after you are gone, or you can spend it with people you love doing things that matter beyond governance. The choice is yours. He looked at her, really looked, not as partner or advisor or co-architect of a system, as the woman who had walked into his fortress 7 years ago and refused to kneel, who had rebuilt him from the inside out, who had stood beside him through every brutal decision and never flinched. The woman he loved more than power, more than legacy, more than the Commonwealth itself. Stay with me. Until the end. I was always going to stay. The question was whether you would let yourself be present or whether you would die still trying to control things you cannot control. I will try to be present. That is all I ask. The last month of his life, Alaric did not attend council meetings. He did not coordinate diplomatic relationships. He did not facilitate consensus or arbitrate disputes. He simply existed, sitting on the porch, reading books he had never made time for, talking with neighbors about ordinary things that had nothing to do with governance. Seraphine remained beside him, not as advisor, but as partner. They talked about everything they had never made time to discuss. Childhoods, dreams that had nothing to do with power, regrets that went deeper than political decisions, the texture of a life lived in constant pressure, and what it meant to finally release that pressure and discover what remained underneath. What remained was simpler than either expected. Not grand philosophy or revolutionary insight, just two people who had found each other in the machinery of power and had chosen to stay together when that machinery no longer defined them. Regional representatives visited, not for governance discussions, but to say goodbye. They thanked him for what he had built, told him the Commonwealth would endure, assured him that his legacy was secure. He accepted their words with gratitude that felt hollow, because legacy was abstraction and he was dying, and dying made abstractions less important than the immediate physical reality of breath becoming difficult and pain becoming constant. Lady Maurice came. She sat with him for an afternoon talking about nothing important. Weather, harvest projections, gossip about minor nobles that would have been beneath their attention when they were coordinating a duchy. The ordinariness was gift, acknowledgement that he was more than his role, more than chancellor, more than duke, just a man dying and grateful for company. Sir Rowan did not come. He had died defending the throne room when Blackstone fell, but Alaric thought about him often in those final weeks. A man who had disagreed with every reform and had died defending them anyway because loyalty was deeper than agreement. That was the kind of complexity that made governing people so difficult and so necessary. You could never reduce them to simple categories. They remained maddeningly, beautifully contradictory until the moment they stopped breathing. On what turned out to be his final day, Alaric woke before dawn and knew. Not from pain or specific symptom, just a knowing that arrived with the same certainty as any decision he had made in 15 years of rule. Today was the last day. His body had reached its limit and would not permit another. He woke Seraphine gently. She opened her eyes and knew immediately. She did not ask how he knew. She simply held him. They sat together on the porch, watching the sun rise one final time. Light spilled across fields where people were already beginning their daily work. Farmers heading to fields. Merchants opening shops. Life continuing with relentless indifference to the fact that one of the architects of the system enabling that life was dying. I am afraid, he said quietly, of dying, of being forgotten, of everything we built becoming background noise that no one remembers or credits to the people who bled for it. She held him closer. You will be forgotten, not immediately, but eventually. Every name fades. Every legacy becomes footnote, becomes erasure. That is not tragedy. That is how it should be. The system is what matters. The people it serves. Not the names of those who built it. If the Commonwealth endures for centuries and no one remembers Alaric Varrington, that is success, because it means the system became so normalized that its origins became irrelevant. That is cold comfort when facing erasure. It is the only honest comfort. You wanted to build something that outlasted you. You succeeded. The cost of that success is that you become unnecessary to what you built. That is not punishment. That is achievement. He leaned his head against hers. I love you. I do not say it enough. I love you more than I have ever loved anything. More than power. More than the duchy. More than the Commonwealth. You are the best thing I ever built. Not a system, a partnership. A life shared with someone who saw me clearly and stayed anyway. I love you too. And I will carry you forward, not by building monuments or demanding people remember you, by continuing the work, by ensuring the Commonwealth remains functional, by honoring what we built together through every decision I make for however long I continue making them. That is legacy, not stone or parchment, living commitment to shared purpose. They sat together as the sun climbed higher. His breathing became more labored. The pressure in his chest intensified until it felt like his entire body was being crushed. But he did not move, did not ask for medicines to dull the pain. He wanted to be present, fully conscious, aware of every moment until there were no more moments. Seraphine felt his breathing change, felt his grip on her hand weaken. She held him and whispered things that did not need to be heard to serve their purpose. Comfort offered not because it changed anything, but because offering it was how love manifested when nothing else could be done. His final thought was not about the Commonwealth or legacy or whether he had succeeded or failed. It was simpler, more immediate, more human. I am not alone. I am dying, and I am not alone. That was enough. His breathing stopped. His heart gave its final beat. His body went still in her arms. Seraphine held him for a long time, crying silently, grieving not just the man but the partnership that had rebuilt an empire and transformed two people who had been alone into two people who had found each other and chosen to stay. When she finally released him and stood, the sun was high and the world continued moving. She walked inside and sent word to the Commonwealth Council. Chancellor Alaric Varrington had died. Succession protocols would be initiated. The system would continue. Then she returned to the porch and sat beside his body, holding his hand one final time, and said goodbye to the man who had been Duke and became Chancellor and ended simply as Alaric. Partner. Love. The person who had seen her clearly and stayed anyway. That was what mattered. Not titles, not systems, not legacy measured in governance structures. Two people who had found each other in the machinery of power and had built something between them that was more valuable than empires. He was gone. She remained. The work continued. That was how it should be. The Commonwealth continued without Alaric. Seraphine served as interim chancellor until the council elected a successor. She coordinated the transition with the same ruthless efficiency she had applied to everything else. Then she stepped back. Not from governance entirely, but from central coordination. She became advisor rather than leader, teacher rather than coordinator, passing knowledge to the next generation while slowly withdrawing from active decision-making. 5 years after Alaric's death, the Commonwealth had expanded to 23 regions. 10 years after, it encompassed most of the territory that had once been the Duchy of Barrington and several neighboring territories that had voluntarily integrated. The system proved resilient enough to absorb growth, adapt to challenges, and maintain governance without collapsing into centralized control. Duke Victor Cardine died 2 years after the treaty. His son attempted to maintain the old system, but found that ruling through absolute authority was expensive and exhausting when surrounded by territories that demonstrated alternative models. Within a generation, even Blackstone Citadel had adopted modified versions of distributed governance, not because anyone forced them, because it worked better than what they had. Seraphine lived another 23 years after Alaric died. She watched the Commonwealth mature into something neither she nor Alaric had imagined. Not perfect, still flawed, but functional in ways that centralized control never achieved. She watched new leaders emerge who had no memory of absolute authority. Children who grew up believing their voices mattered in governance because the system was designed to include them. On her final day, she sat in the same house she had shared with Alaric, on the same porch where he had died, and felt satisfied in ways that had nothing to do with accomplishment. She had built something with someone she loved. That construction had required blood and sacrifice and compromise and pain, but it had created structures that served people rather than exploited them. That was enough. She died quietly. No drama, no final declarations. Just an elderly woman who had rebuilt an empire and chosen to spend her final years gardening and reading and occasionally advising young council members who asked her questions about the early days. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. Regional representatives, former colleagues, people whose lives had been shaped by the system she and Alaric had built. They eulogized her contributions, praised her vision, promised to honor her legacy. Then they returned to their regions and continued governing, because the system did not stop when she died. It continued functioning because it was designed to function independently of any individual. That was the point. That was always the point. 50 years after Alaric's death, the Commonwealth was referenced in histories as an early example of federated governance. Alaric Barrington was mentioned briefly as the Duke who initiated reforms. Seraphine Lorne received a footnote as his chief advisor. The details of the siege, the war, the 4,000 deaths, all of it was condensed into paragraphs that focused on structural innovation rather than human cost. 100 years after, even those paragraphs were absorbed into broader narratives about political evolution. Alaric and Seraphine became names in lists of reformers whose specific contributions were less important than the general trajectory they represented. 200 years after, they were forgotten entirely by everyone except historians researching obscure governance transitions. The Commonwealth had evolved so far beyond its origins that tracing it back to two people in a farmhouse seemed almost irrelevant. The system endured. The names faded. The work continued, exactly as intended, exactly as it should be. And in that erasure, in that quiet disappearance into the background of history, lay the truest measure of success. They had built something that outlasted them. Something that became so normalized it no longer required attribution. Something that served people rather than demanding recognition. That was legacy. Not monuments, not histories, not names preserved in stone. Systems that functioned so well they became invisible. Structures so resilient they survived their architects. Governance so effective it felt like natural order rather than human construction. Duke Alaric Barrington and Lady Seraphine Lorne had wanted to prove that power could be remade without violence, that control could become creation, that systems could endure beyond individuals. They had succeeded. The cost was 4,000 lives, 2 decades of effort, and eventual erasure from collective memory. Whether that was triumph or tragedy depended on which question you asked. If you measured success by recognition, they had failed. If you measured it by function, they had exceeded every expectation. The Commonwealth stood. Commonwealth. The people it served lived lives shaped by structures that distributed power rather than concentrated it. That was the only measurement that mattered. Everything else was just noise. The work had been completed, the system had been built, the architects had died, and the structure they created continued standing long after their names were forgotten, serving purposes they had imagined and purposes they could never have predicted. Enduring through centuries not because it was perfect, but because it was resilient, adapting to pressure without collapsing, evolving without losing core principles, proving that power remade through will and structure could indeed outlast the people who remade it. That was the answer to every question they had asked. That was the legacy worth dying for, and that was enough.